Hey, how's it going, everybody? It's 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and you know what that is. You know what that means. We're live from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea. I'm stuttering all over myself today. It's one of those days. It's the middle of the week. I'm overworked. I'm tired, but we're here. And I'm also very grateful because today we've got a special guest on the screen. Shout out to my man, Brian. Brian, what's good, dude?
I'm doing well. I'm just realizing that I have to watch your stream in order to see the chat. So that's interesting.
Yeah. You know, it's one of those things that it takes some getting used to. I don't do a whole lot of guests on the live purely because I'm not super confident in setting it up for guests, but it's one of those things that I aim to get better at. And you know, one of the reasons why I'm really excited to have you on the stream today is because I feel like you have a wealth of information to share with the people. People might not know this, but before I had the channel, I was a super fan, and I'm one of those people that gets lost in the rabbit hole of information. I can never have enough. And your content on Instagram was one of the few that really caught my interest because you talk about Rockwell hardness, you talk about different steels, you were doing regrinds and reblades, and you're kind of a self-made man doing all of that stuff. And so I thought it'd be really cool to have you on. And so first of all, thank you for agreeing to come on the live. I'm really excited. I'm going to pick your brain about some things. But one of the things that I was curious about was, when did you get started doing the regrind and working out of your garage doing regrinds and reblades?
Oh man, roll really quickly. Your volume is low, is what people are saying.
My volume is that better?
Oh, I don't know. It's fine for me, but people are saying it's low.
Ian says a dog must be licking Brian's mic.
I don't know what to do about that.
It's probably my fault. It's probably my fault, guys. My setup is hasty at best, but we'll get through it.
But yeah, so to answer your question, so I started making knives like 5 years ago. I know the date, it was May 2019, so I guess that's like 6 years ago, almost. Mm-hmm. But I didn't really seriously do it for a while. I just sort of made some fixed blades here and there. And then the idea to start doing the regrinds and the reblades and stuff was 4.5 years ago. Which is really interesting because I was really bad at it, to be frank. And, we were talking obviously before the live stream started about how it'd be interesting to talk about finances. When I first started making reblades, I was not making any money. But my prices were about the same as they are today, which is, it's interesting when you think of it that way. It's like, wait, your prices are the same, but you made negative money back then, and you make decent money now. What changed? And it just comes down to how much you're moving, right? How much you're making and how much you're actually selling, and how much scrap you're making. So, it's an interesting thing. But that's when I started. It's 4.5 years ago.
Man, well, I imagine that it has a lot to do with how many times you have to start over. And I think it's really funny that you mentioned, well, you started out and you were bad. I don't know if you do this, but sometimes when I need inspiration, I watch my older videos because they're awful. My first videos are not good. And some people may disagree. Like, oh, your early stuff was okay. But I watch my older stuff and I cringe. And I keep it around because it helps me figure out, how far I've come, but also how far I still want to go. And so I'm curious, do you ever do that? Do you ever look at some of your older stuff for inspiration?
I do, but instead of cringing, I just feel proud because I'm I've come a long way from that.
That's a good mindset to have.
Yeah. It's just a different way to react to this in the same way, right? Essentially, if you cringe, it's because, you're proud of where you are now. But I just don't really do the cringing part. I'm it's natural for us to suck when we start at anything. So
right. Absolutely, dude. And for me, I agree with you on the amount of time, because I spend a lot less time making the content now than I used to, because I have to re-record a lot less. You know, like I have a mental tick where, you know, anything that I make, I want to make it as good as I possibly can, because I don't know, you know, when YouTube's going to say, okay, you know, shelf life, get out of here. You know, we're not showing your stuff to anybody else, because every YouTuber has a shelf life. And so one day when YouTube flips the switch on my channel, I still want to be able to look back at the library of my work and be proud of what I put out there, just as a, you know, a library of work. And, you know, for what you do, I think it's crazy. You know, I watch your Instagram all the time, and it's really cool that you put up, you know, things like, you know, your mistakes. Even your mistakes sell out super fast. You know, there have been times where I had money. I was like, okay, I'm going to watch Brian's Instagram today, see if he puts anything up for, you know, first come, first serve. And you'll pop up something like, oh, you know, I did a misgrind on this, or, you know, this part isn't perfect. Sold immediately.
Yeah, I do try to put like either, you know, if it's really bad, then I'll give it away for free. If it's like a small thing, I still try to make it a pretty significant discount, right? Like, that is actually an interesting subject though in itself, is the idea of giving away blems and stuff like that. If you're familiar with, you know, Grimsmo's policy on it, they will never let anything out that is not like a perfect thing that they'll sell for retail.
Right.
And the reason for that is that they don't want anything to go out of their shop that, you know, people could, you know, sell to other people and say like, oh, this is an example of Grimsmo's work and it has a flaw, right? And so, you know, I think there's ways around that are pretty simple though. Like Spyderco has their seconds way where they mark seconds blades. So like, you know, I don't really understand that mindset. I'm like, if I could give someone a good deal on something, I'm gonna do it. And I do have a way of marking my blades that are not problematic, right? Like, you know, I'll just, because I put a laser engraved serial number on the spine of a blade if it's good to go. And so, you know, if it doesn't have that, then it's a blem or a seconds or something usually.
Well, so it's, you know, it's kind of funny you mentioned that, because like on the Spyderco seconds, most people will claim that they can't see why it was marked as a second. And yeah, I've looked at a lot of your stuff that you've marked, and you're like, oh, you know, I messed up here, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, that looks great to me, you know? And it makes me wonder if maybe sometimes, you know, when you're putting out a product, you know, whether it's a video or a knife or a regrind or whatever it is, the maker always has that super fine tuned sense of, you know, if something went wrong to their expectations. Do you ever feel like maybe you go a little too hard on yourself on those, or?
There's definitely a lot of situations where I know that no one else is going to notice something, and I still say it's a seconds. But I still like to do it because I feel like it keeps my standards higher and it pushes me to improve. Like, so here's my thing. So if I, like, let's say I acknowledge I made like something that could be better, right? And I sell it for the full amount, even if I disclose that, right? Even if I say, look, I'm not completely like proud of this in some sense, like there's a minor thing, but I still sell it and get money out of it. Like, I feel like it doesn't encourage me to be better, because you really, like, I see it as like you have to punish yourself in a sense to motivate yourself to be better. And so like if I let something go, but I like an issue go and I make the full amount of money on it, then what is my incentive internally to improve? Because I'm still making the same amount of money. And, you know, it's not all about money, sure, but I use money as a way to motivate myself. Like if I say like, I don't want myself to like sharpen the heel this way. Okay, then every time I do that, I'm going to give it away for free. And then because I lose money, the pain of that will make me not do it again. You know? So that's how I see it.
Yeah, man, that's great. You know, one of the things that I think about when I think about some of the stuff that you've either sold cheap because it didn't meet your standards, or given away because it didn't meet your standards. Do you remember the first time you did and maybe I'm just thinking of it as the first time because that's the first time I saw it. You were doing a reblade for a 80-20.5 and the deployment hole came out squished. Do you remember that?
Yes, the droopy.
Yeah, the droopy. It wasn't too long after that all of a sudden Demco started doing a deployment hole that looked very, very similar to that, but on purpose. And the first thought in my head was, must be a Transparent Knives fan. Andrew Demko must be a Transparent Knives fan.
Funny enough, so I know Demko doesn't like me. We never talked though.
Sure.
But he actually just doesn't like modders in general. So like, it's not like a personal thing. But yeah, like there have been some times where like I've come out with something and then like shortly after it becomes like a Demko official thing. So like, harpoon blades, for example, originally you had the clip point and the shark's foot.
Right.
And then, later on he came out with the harpoon. And then, for example, like the shark cub, I came out with the shark pup before that, which is like a chopped 20.5. And obviously there's no such thing as a shark pup, there's no such thing as a shark cub. But because shark pup was already sort of, taken, I guess that's why he chose shark cub as the word that he used. So, there's been some cases of that. I don't personally mind. I think it's like, in some sense, like an honor for like a mod to become like an official thing.
I don't know, man. I think he should put you on the payroll, Transparent Knives, R&D.
Yeah, I mean, but, ultimately, like, I just see it as like, it's your product, so you can do whatever you want with it, if you see a mod. But what I will say is that, I encourage makers and companies, if you're going to get inspiration from a modder, just shout them out.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's I see the same thing happen with content creators, and I have to really rein it in sometimes because like I forget just how many channels are out there and how much content is out there. It's really hard to come out with content that is original. It's really hard to do that, especially in the knife and EDC niche, because, so every time I think I've done something that people aren't doing, I find a way to prove myself wrong. And, I think that's important, to be like, even if you think you're the first one to do it, chances are you're not. And so I've seen certain ideas that I've done, and then, a little while later, I'll see someone else do it. And the moment I think, well, they stole that from me, I'll go and I'm like, nope, you got to prove yourself wrong now. You can't let your ego get the best of you. And I'll just start searching YouTube for that.
Yep, for sure. And here's the other thing. Like, so, and this is why, like, I partially don't care and I've never called Demko out on it or anything. Is because, like, who knows? Maybe before they even released the 20.5, they had draft notes of harpoon blades, right? Like years ago, right? Like, you never know. So, you never really know if someone like copied you or took inspiration from you, even unless they say so.
Right.
Yeah. So
I don't know, man. I want to say you're the first one I've ever seen with the squish deployment hole, and I think he needs to give you some credit for that personally.
Yeah, and I don't even know. I have no idea. Like, I don't really care, so I don't track that kind of stuff. I just go like, yeah, whatever. It is what it is,
Well, that brings me to something else I wanted to ask you. Like, because not only do you do reblades, you also do regrinds, and that's a whole different beast in itself. Because I imagine that when you're regrinding the blade, you're probably making sure that you're not grinding it too hot because you don't want to mess with the heat treat. But it made me ask the question: does every knife need a regrind or a reblade, or are there some knives that are off limits that you look at and you're like, what, this is perfect, it doesn't need to be touched? Is there any knives that you look at and you're like, nope, off limits, I'm not doing it?
Yes. Now, partially that is because I can't do it sometimes, right? Like, there's limitations to what you can regrind. Like maybe the grind. So here's an example. Like, you can't really regrind an Oz Roosevelt, and you also don't really need to, because it comes very thin to begin with, and the plunge line, because he grinds it with a disc, is curved. Now, when you grind with a belt, it has to be straight, right? So there's certainly, that's an example where like I don't want to regrind it, and I also can't. So that but even if I could, like, let's say the plunge line was straight, I think it's thin enough as is where it's like not really a meaningful mod. So I wouldn't even want, like, if a customer said like, hey, I have this Oz Roosevelt with a straight plunge, can you regrind it? I would just be like, look, it's not really going to make enough of a difference. I don't even want to charge you to like, do like put a grind on it, because like You know what I mean? Like it
Yeah.
feels like I'm just like stealing money then because I'm not really doing any work.
Yeah, but then there's some knives that really benefit from a regrind.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
You know, like I have a few that I look at and I'm like, you know what, I should hit up Brian, see if if he could put me on the books. The one I'm thinking of specifically is I have the AR 0.75, the Strider AR 0.75, and that knife is thick, like with 2 C's thick, and I put on Jared Neve's recommendation, because I was asking Jared, I was like, dude, this thing is basically just, because it's OEM'd by Medford. It's Strider's design, but it's OEM'd by Medford. So of course, it's super thick. I want to, it's not quite a 1/4 inch thick on the spine, but it's thick. And so it doesn't get very thin behind the edge and it doesn't stay very thin. So the moment I went down to even 20 degrees per side, fat edge bevel immediately. And it definitely cuts a lot better than it did factory. Factory, it was a working edge, but it, like, in my mind, I'm always telling myself the main purpose of a knife is to cut. And so if it doesn't cut, it's not a knife. So it needs to cut. And then I'll, go through like 4 diamond stones trying to basically do something that could be achieved better with a regrind. Now I don't have those skills, like I don't have the space for it. What are your thoughts on regrinding something like a Strider AR 0.75? And I'll pull one up on the screen for reference. I know you probably know the one I'm talking about.
Wait, sorry, can you say that one more time? Like regrinding a Strider AR?
Yeah.
Let me. I'd have to actually see it. So, because here's the interesting thing. So, I used to do all my regrinds freehand, and there are some limitations with doing it the current way I do it, which is with a jig.
Mm-hmm.
If it's like I believe that because the AR is actually made by Medford, I believe.
Right. Yeah.
And so the way Medford grinds, it's all freehand as well. Like all his employees grind freehand. And so you'll see, like, if you have a belly, right? Let's say this is like the belly of your knife. The grind will follow that belly. What you'll notice with my grinds is that even if there's a belly, the grind line is straight across.
Right.
So that's what happens with the jig.
Yeah. So like I've got a Praetorian on the table right now, and that's exactly what I was actually just thinking about that.
You're right. See how like that line, the grind line follows the edge where it's like curved. Yeah, that's a product of freehand, whereas the way I do it is with a jig. So
I don't know if you can see my screen share, but I've got the AR 0.75 that I own. I've got it up on the screen. And so this one is the Tanto version. And so that's what it looks like stock, right?
Yeah.
Hold on. I'm going to grab mine real quick and I'll show you. So this is the edge bevel on it now, and I put a mirror finish on it, but it's super thick and it does cut better. But I was thinking about it, like, I wonder how well this would benefit from a regrind, because it's still a little bit of a sharpened pry bar.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, and I can't help but wonder, would it be worth it to do something like that if the goal is to make that edge bevel a little less thick? And I'll put it up there on the screen. To make it a little less thick and a little more slicey. Would a regrind accomplish that, do you think?
It definitely would. And that looks like something that, like, it's a Tanto, so I don't have a lot of experience with compound Tantos personally. There are people who used to do it. Like, one example is like MS Custom Knives used to do compound regrinds. He like disappeared off the face of the planet though, so I don't think you can send it to him anymore. But yeah, no, if you knew someone who could do a compound regrind, like, that would definitely help a lot, I think.
All right. Yeah, because I was thinking about it. I was like, this could be a super slicer. And how cool would it be to have a knife that was stupidly thick, behind the spine, but then nice and thin behind the edge? I had a knife that did that. It was the Midgards Messer Thunrar. And it was really funny because people would they'd look at it, 1/4 inch, and I'm not joking, 1/4 inch thick spine, but then super thin. It was almost like a competition chopper style, and like it would push cut through stuff that a knife with a spine that thick has no business cutting that cleanly, but because it had such a tall blade geometry and it was so thin behind the edge, it's sliced beautifully. I kind of wish I didn't sell it. We do have a super chat I want to get to. Thank you, Night Rare, for the $2 super. He says, can Brian mod a Jot Sing Khosla? I might not be saying that right. It says a Jot Sling Khosla into a good knife.
I don't know what that is. I have to look it up.
Yeah. Jot Sing Khosla. I'm gonna pull it up on the screen share.
I see this knife.
Oh, this was in the Only Spartans Discord today. I think oh man, that's, and the funny thing is, if you start from left to right, you're like, oh, nice, 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 and then you get to that camel's hump, and it's just, why Spyderco? Why? Why do they?
Yeah, I don't know about that one.
That's gonna be a no for me, dog. I love Spydercos, and I embrace some of their weirdness, but that's kind of a bit too far for me. But
I mean, geez, I'm just imagining chopping off that hump and then putting a thumb stud.
Look, if they just went straight across, and just
I'm imagining it now. I'm putting my finger on my screen, and it looks like a totally normal knife if you chop the hump off.
Well, you know what you could do on something like this? You could probably chop that thumb deployment right off, and you might also be able to make that into an Emerson wave.
Yeah.
Because it's making me think of, if you were to do that, it would almost be more of the traditional style blades that we saw coming out of like Emerson and why is the name eluding me? But where it kind of has a little bit of a hump going into the spine of the blade.
Yeah, you could chop the hump off, chop a little bit of the pointy end of the handle off at the butt.
Yeah, that's pretty hideous too.
Yeah, add a thumb stud or something, and then it'd be a pretty decent looking knife.
I mean, $300 MSRP. What were they thinking? I mean, I don't know if someone could pay me $300 to rep this knife personally. I would have to modify that. That is hideous.
Yeah, I'm like that with a lot of. I'm even if you paid me, I really don't want it.
I can't believe that they discontinued this knife. It baffles the mind. Before we go to left field, I did want to talk to you a little bit about the expectations of people, because when you're just a consumer, you only know what you know. And one of the things that a lot of people wonder is, how much money do knife makers make? And we started to talk about it a little bit before the live, but I was curious. You're in contact with a lot of knife makers. The community really well at this point. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I'll say, obviously, it depends on where you're at in your knife making career. For the vast majority of knife makers I know, in the first 1 to 2 years of making knives, they made less than $0. So most knife makers I know of, there's exceptions, right? But most knife makers I know, in the beginning they made no money. They had to subsidize their knife making with a real job. For example, in the process of learning, you mess up a lot of blades, practicing how to learn how to grind. So you're spending more money than you make actually in the beginning, right? Later on, once you start developing a bit of a process, I'll give myself as an example though. So just to give some numbers for perspective. So like I said, I started making reblades 4.5 years ago. In the first 3 years that I was making reblades, I made approximately 100 reblades a year. and I made about total $15,000 per year total, which is less than minimum wage.
Wow.
That was the first 3 years. It's only in the past year and a half that like I've been doing pretty well. So yeah, like I was like dirt poor for like the first like 4 years of making knives, because obviously there's the first year where I was making fixed blades, and then you know the reblades and regrinds after that. So I was like exceptionally poor. Like I believe that the way it came out to was about I made about $50 per day. And that's working more hours than a normal work day, because I work about 12 to 13 hours a day. So I'd work 12 to 13 hours a day and make $50, which is really bad, because in California, which is where I live and it's more expensive here, minimum wage is $15. So it's really bad. Now, this is not a woe is me story or anything like that. I actually make pretty decent money now. And so, but I just want to give the perspective of like, you can start out and make nothing. You can make negative money, right? In the beginning. And so now, in a very, very good month, like very, very good month now, I could make $15,000 in 1 month.
Wow.
Which is yeah.
But you had to pay your dues to get there. And I think that that's what a lot of people don't understand is that, you know, when you see a small batch maker, you know, like for example, I think of, you know, Craig Brown Knives, you know, $800. And some people that don't know any better will look at this and they'll say, oh, that's too expensive. You know, titanium isn't that expensive. And it's like, you gotta think about like all of the dues you have to pay to get to the point where you can make something like this, you know, because that's the level of knowledge. You know, like you say, for example, that you were making less than minimum wage. That's not a monetary thing, but you were basically your own intern, you know, teaching yourself how to do those things. And so what you were getting paid in was the experience to get to this point, you know, because I've often had, you know, a pipe dream where I was like, you know, if I had the space, you know, could I get myself a forge? You know, like I like forged in fire, just like, you know, the next guy, you know, I want to know if it'll kill. But I started thinking about like all the space you need, all the time you need. And I think that's usually the deal killer for a lot of people is how much time does it take to become proficient in it? And how much money are you willing to invest in it, before you are able to get to a point where you can actually recoup? And I think that a lot of dreams end before they begin because people start to realize that, and they figure out really quickly, whoa, this is a lot. So yeah. So to answer your question, GSK, because he said, is that gross or net? Basically, my net income in the first 4 years, my net income was $15,000 a year. Net. Now my net income now, if I have a very, very, very good month, would be $15,000. But that's considering the fact that I work 91 hours a week. So there's that, right? Like, it's not like, you know what I mean? Like, because like people have this tendency to be like, okay, you make like, let's say you make this much money, right? Then I just divide it by this number of hours because that's a standard, you know, work week, right? That's not how that works in knife making. We work 7 hours a day, 12 to 13 hours a day. So it's just not even comparable in terms of the number of hours that we're putting in. And so per hour, you can split like what I make by more than half, right? Because an average work week is what, like 40 hours? Yep. So I work double what the average person is working. Yeah, and there's no overtime when you work for yourself, you know. I think that there's a lot. People ask me all the time, they're like, oh, when are you going to go full time? And, you know, full time on the channel. I would love to do that. But also I'm also enjoying not necessarily doing that, because once you work for yourself, the pressure's on. You know, it's up to you. Sure. If you work overtime, only you can pay yourself that. You know, you're responsible for all the taxes. You're responsible for, you know, all the time you spend. You have to, and I think that budgeting your time is probably something that's really tough. You know, anytime I see you post a video during the regular day, you know, usually I'm I'm at work and I was like, oh, Brian just posted a video, and I can tell, dude, you got the steel dust on your hands. You know, you can tell that you've been working. You know,
yeah. So people point that out a lot. They're like, "Why are your hands dirty? Clean your hands." And I'm like, "Bro, I'm doing stuff. I stopped grinding for like 5 minutes to be able to make this video or post this picture. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like I was sitting on the couch and I got up to post a video. Like, I was literally grinding like 5 minutes ago. You know, like I wash my hands lightly real quick, but it doesn't really get everything off. Right. It's not dirt; it's steel dust. So it doesn't like gets in your nails. That doesn't wash out with soap and water. Like, so yes, and so a lot of times people say that, I'll just be like, look, I'm working. Like, you know, I can't like I can't scrub my nails before every video or picture I post. And I'm also not going to do that because I'm about to go right back to work after the video and get my hands dirty again. You know? So it's like it would be a pointless endeavor. And so
for sure, man. Yeah. But I mean, I guess at this point you're probably you're doing the knife making stuff and the regrinds and the reblades full time. You don't do anything else on the side anymore, right?
No, I don't do anything else. That's pretty much the main thing. I'm saving up for a CNC so I can make my own full customs. So yeah, that's basically like if I have like 3 good months in a row, I can buy the CNC, which would be awesome. So that's what I'm aiming for.
Dude, that's awesome, man. And you brought your first custom knife to, was it Blade Show at Atlanta last year or Blade Show? I'm trying to remember which one it was.
Like my first time I went to Blade Show and exhibited.
Yeah, because I thought last year you brought like a custom fixed blade that you made to a Blade Show. I might be getting my timeline.
No, I did exhibit once. That was in 2023, and I just brought some reblades.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. You could tell that my brain is fried. It's like I have a regular full-time job, and then I have the channel. And you know, and then I also have to make time for my family. That's important too.
For sure.
And so for me, my timeline's like, oh yeah, this happened yesterday. Nope. It was over a year ago.
Yeah. And really quick, to answer a question, Matt D, he said, what CNC are you looking to get? I'm looking to get a Sile X5. All in, it'll cost me about $50,000. And this is another thing I want to talk about briefly is like machines are extremely expensive. The vast majority of makers don't have disposable income like that. Like most people aren't sitting on $50,000, so they have to take out a loan. Now, I think that it's perfectly smart to take out a loan. I have no intention of taking out a loan. I want to pay for it in cash. And that's because I have bipolar disorder. And so my mental health is not completely stable and reliable. Therefore, I don't want to owe money and have to make payments and then potentially get depressed or something. So I want to just be able to buy the machine outright and just be like, I have it. I have no payments. I don't owe anyone anything.
Think about how victorious that moment's going to be, though. Like when they deliver it, and I imagine that they probably deliver it in several pieces. Like you have to.
No, it's one unit. It just comes in one unit. Yeah.
Do they deliver that on like a semi or?
So yeah, some you have to pay for shipping. Obviously, I included the price of shipping in that $50,000, but you will have to pay a substantial amount to ship it.
So while I got you here, I wanted to ask you about something. So contoured handle scales, right? This is the TRM Neutron lizard skin titanium handle scales. I preach about this all the time, where I tell people that they don't understand how good of a deal this is. To be a American-made contoured 3D milled titanium handle scale set on a knife that costs less than $500. You know, you can't do this on a regular, CNC mill. You need something that's specialized to be able to hit it on multiple axes, right?
So so here's the interesting thing. So the reason I say that it's more expensive generally to do CNC or to do the contoured handles, it depends on what you have. So if you have a CNC, it doesn't really make that much a difference to do contoured handles versus smooth titanium handles. But obviously, it's very expensive to get a CNC. Now you can do flat slab handles without having a CNC at all. You can just double disc grind them. Which is just having 2 abrasive discs on both sides. You put the handle scale in between them, and then it grinds it to that thickness and keeps it flat and parallel while getting to your final thickness. That's how a lot of makers grind down their flat slab handle scales. And so, and then they'll just, shape the chamfers and stuff by hand afterwards. And so, that's part of the reason why I say it's more expensive is just because it's not that the process is necessarily more expensive if you have a CNC. It's that you have to have a CNC. Like you have to, you're making payments on that expensive machine. You're paying for the tooling, all that. Whereas like double disc grinding is extraordinarily like cheap in comparison. And you can just outsource it to like one of a million double disc grinding companies in the country. So yeah.
So like I was thinking about it the other day, cause I was like, if you were to do slab style scales, you could do, slab and then chamfer, and then hand sand over to get your contouring. And that like, even that seems like that would be expensive, cause then you're spending a lot of time getting the angle on that contour right. And I guess what really impressed me on the TRM lizard skin scales is that the diamond texturing is 3D, so like I look at this and I'm like, that has to be all done on one CNC. And
and you have to do the programming in CAD and Fusion 360 or whatever CAD software you use. And here's another thing I'll say. So you have to learn how to do that. Learning anything costs a substantial amount of money because it's time. And so Think about it this way. Like if I'm a knife maker, I work 91 hours a week, right? Well, there's no other time in my day to learn new skills. So if I want to learn how to do CAD and learn how to do that kind of like texturing on a 3D scale, that means I have to stop working in order, because I have no leisure time. So I have to stop working in order to learn how to do CAD, for example. I have to, take CAD courses, whatever. And so let's say I take like 3 hours out of my day every day to like, practice CAD, which is probably pretty reasonable for actually learning in an effective way and finishing a CAD course, right? That would cost me approximately 20 hours a week, which is all lost money, right? Because that's time I could have spent making knives.
Man. And it's crazy when you start thinking about it like that, because every minute of your regular work week is accounted for, and and that's the other thing is when you're working for yourself, your time is literally money. On the topic,
there's no salary.
There's no salary. There's no benefits.
If you don't make something that day, you get no money.
There's no PTO.
Yeah, there isn't. Yeah, and there's no health insurance either. Like there's no employee given health insurance. Like we have to fund our own health insurance. We have to fund our own paid time off or vacation if you want to have that. Like that's all on you. So.
Oh man, 100%, dude. And I just want to shout out Knives Fast. Shout out to Knives Fast. Welcome in, man. Good to see Casey. What's up, dude? And also, I know that we have, we in the Discord we started a thread for people that wanted to post what their regular, everyday job was, because people are interested in what everyone does. Everyone wants to know what everyone does. And the amount of machinists and people that work with mills and work with, these, it blew me away. When I started seeing what everyone posts, like, oh, I work with the mill, I work with the lathe. And I'm like, no wonder we're all knife nuts. We were doomed from the start. We're all interested in how these things are made and the intricacies in it. And so that was really interesting to me. Before we get too deep in, one of the things, as one of the things we do is the pocket check.
Yeah.
So we're going to go through and I'm just going to go ahead and shout out some pocket checks. And guys, I know I haven't been super into the chat so far. Believe it or not, this is the first time I've ever had a camera to camera conversation with Brian before. And so you guys will have to forgive me. I haven't been super active in the chat, but let's go ahead and check out some of these pocket checks. And I'm just going to scroll up here for those who might be new to the live stream. If this is your first time tuning in, you might be wondering, how do I get on the Discord? How do I, get my pocket check out there? This is open to channel members. I make my membership as cheap as YouTube will let me. It's like $3, $2.99, something like that. Once you're a channel member, go to my post section of the YouTube channel and it will let you click on an invite link that members can see. Once you're in, you're in. You don't have to remain a channel member to stay in the Discord, but if you leave, you have to be a channel member to get back in. So This is where it's at. We're going to start off with Vivelsky. Sweet photo, man. He's got the Kaiser Militar with the PEI and the Flytanium Arcade with the Flytanium Shark Lock that they licensed from Demko. Nick
Very
T.
aesthetic photo.
Oh man, when it comes to the Shark Lock, I kind of love it and I kind of hate it at the same time. I love it because it's a super strong lock, but I also hate it because and you pointed this out on one of your videos on Andrew Demko allows for a certain level of wiggle and jiggle that I think is criminal. And I didn't notice it until you pointed it out. I took my knife apart, I put it back together, and there was a tiny amount of play, just a tiny amount of play. And if I tuned it right, like if I tuned it out where there was no play, the action was awful. And if I loosened it up just a little bit, boom, play. And it makes me wonder, is that, while I got you here, man, I know you've gone down that rabbit hole before. Is that based on the lock itself or something else?
So there's two aspects to it. So in the up and down direction, right, vertical play, there's ways to make it so that there's absolutely none and it's just as solid as like a frame lock. So when there's up and down play, there's other things that play like that are something's wrong,
right?
Basically, and that comes down to tolerances. Basically, I don't know who his OEM is. I know it's he makes the 20S's in the States, and then the 20.5s are made in Taiwan. I don't know who their OEM is, but their pin tolerance is awful. So those pins that you put in the scales, right, those 3 pins, they're like not always the same diameter, which they should be. And so the tolerances are just not tight enough on those pins. And so if there's slop in the pins, then it's not even that the blade is moving up and down, it's that the pins aren't moving, and so it feels like the blade is moving.
So I have a theory, right? Because Demko was this big cold steel guy. He did so much work with cold steel. Cold steel has, I believe, the majority, if not all, of their knives made in Taiwan. So I imagine that it's the same OEM that Cold Steel used because he probably just had those connections already. Something that I think is interesting is, if we talk about knives made in China, we know all the big OEMs. We know that We does OEM work. Rayot does OEM work. There's a ton of known Chinese OEMs. We can put a name to it. But I don't really know, if anyone knows any like well-known Taiwanese OEMs. Like they're always just unnamed, unmentioned. Like
people are somehow just okay with that. They're just like, I don't need to know.
It's made in Taiwan. Perfect. Is it coming out of Spyderco's factory? And I don't even know if it matters. We all just want our knives to be made well at the end of the day, no matter where it's made. We just want it to be made well. But I think that, we place a lot of value on the name, like, oh, this was OEM'd by Rayot or Riot, however you say it. So it must be good. It must be amazing. But people always forget, like these OEMs, they're making it to spec. So it's only as good as what gets sent over. And the best OEMs are the ones, would you agree that the best OEMs are the ones that make it exactly to spec without taking extra liberties? Or do you think that's a good question. It's better if they take a few liberties because they're actually the ones making those prototypes initially, and so they see it up front instead of making it perfectly to spec? What do you think?
I'm going to say it depends, because there are some designers who really do know what they're doing, and you need to just listen and like do it to spec. There are some designers who don't know what they're doing, and so like the company is understandably going to be like, look, to make it work, we need to make some changes. So really, I think it depends on the experience of the designer. I think that if you've worked with a designer before, that like they know what they're doing and they send you a proper CAD file. As an OEM, your responsibility is to make it to spec. But if you can obviously point out like this is wrong, then then it's your responsibility to be like, look, this isn't going to work. Don't you know what I mean?
Yeah. So something that kind of spurred that thought with me is watching Lefty EDC go through his prototype process. And, Kev's great. He shares all of this stuff. He's very open about, at least with other channels who ask. And he'll be like, oh, yeah, check this out, guys. I've got, 3 prototypes from 3 different OEMs for this one design. And here's how it turned out. And he'll put it on his video. And you're like, he sent the same CAD file to all 3 OEMs. but they all came out a little bit differently, and they all took little liberties, and you're like, well, you know, like, okay, concept, you know, that looks amazing, but where's our single-sided captive pivot?
Yes. I do think that there's a tendency of some OEMs, like some things are certainly lost in translation, but other things are lost in how do I say this? They're like cutting corners, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not great, obviously. You know, you want your OEM to, like, if they make a change, it should be a change for the better, right? There should never be a change for the worse. And so, like, captive pivot is obviously just, like, generally speaking, better, right? So, you know, yeah, I think that, but, you know, here's another thing. Like, I've noticed some talk recently about certain, like, features of knives that people say are really, really good. And I get it, but I think it's important for people to understand how these things are achieved. So to give you a concrete example, like some people have been saying recently, like WE knives action has improved, right? Like recent WE knives feel like they drop kind of more, like they have more droppy action, like they're more like, you know, smooth and whatever. And I was suspicious about this, so I actually went and like checked out a bunch of WE knives at a knife show at CCKS last month, because I had my suspicions on how they were achieving this. Because I was like, there's no way, like, I know they're using the same bearings. I know that, like, it's not like their tolerances got better. Like, there's nothing they've changed or announced or anything. Like, things seem to be mostly the same. So what could they change? Like, what's one thing they could change that would automatically make their action seem better, but really it's lower quality, right? Because like I was thinking about this, and the big thing is pivot tolerances. And so the way that they do it is they actually have made it so there's more slop in the pivot, which contributes heavily to whether or not your blade is going to be droppy or not. But if you actually pull your blade out and you tug on it, you'll feel that pivot slop. Now, you won't feel that unless you deliberately pull your blade out and yank on it, right? And that's not something most people do, so they don't notice that there was a decrease in tolerances and quality. But for me, that matters. Like, I'm like, no, I don't want any pivot slop, right? If you're gonna, like, to give you an example of a knife, that's perfect. This is my Utzler Duck. This has 0 pivot slop, like very, very tight pivot clearances, and that's how it drops. That's actually impressive.
Yeah.
But the way that WE has been accomplishing it, in my mind, is not as impressive.
Yeah, because they're basically I mean, they're capitalizing on people who like the guillotine action. You know, people have. There's been a trend for drop shut. And, you know,
yeah, exactly.
For me, and I'll say this, that used to be me. I watched a video from Medford the other day, and I know Medford entirely unpopular individual for, you know, for who he is. That's aside from the point. He was talking about how crazy the tolerances are, because some people don't understand why, you know, they could get a Praetorian and there could be 2 washers on one side and 1 on the other, or 3 on one side and 2 on the other. And it's because, you know, specifically with washers, what happens is they're not all milled perfectly exact. There's usually some variance that you couldn't see with the eye, but if you were to measure it, it's measurable. And
yes,
so when you chase those crazy tolerances, you end up with some washers that you have to do 2 that are that equal out to whatever thickness you were going for, and maybe only 1 on the other side that's a little bit thicker, but it's close, and it's so close. And so it's funny you mentioned that, because what he mentioned in his video that I watched was, you know, everyone wants bearings, but with bearings, something that you get that you don't get with washers is if you torque the blade against the pivot and then you rotate it, you can actually basically kill your it wears it to a point where you can actually wear in wiggle and jiggle that you can't with washers. And so when you mentioned the pivot slop, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, so on that note, just to explain that a little more in detail, it's because the way that his washers were being produced is they're being punched out, right? Because they're phosphor bronze washers, you punch them out, and when you punch it out, there's sort of like almost like a burr. It's like cupped a little bit, And that cupping creates a little bit of difference in what the, you know, true thickness of the washer is. And so because everything has a tolerance, right? Like, you know, let's say like, I think his washer tolerance was actually a little bit bigger than you would like to see, but it was like about plus or minus 1 thou. So you would have 2 5 thou washers on one side and 1 10 thou washer on the other. And you'd be like, well, you know, why not just have 2 10 thou washers so it's equal? Well, because the 10 thou washer might actually be 11 thou because it's plus or minus 1 thou. And then you have 2 5 thou washers. One might be 5, one might be 6. So now you have both being 11. If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it absolutely makes sense. You know, like when you're talking about the difference of 1,000, people are never going to see that difference. They'll look at that and be like, oh, this must have been an issue from the factory. They didn't realize they gave me 2 and this is janky. They should have just used 2. But, you know, on the topic of pivot slop, it always makes me wonder, like, do we chase the wrong things? Like we ask for things as consumers, and the companies, they want to give us what we ask for because they want us to spend our money. It's like, oh, you want it to be more drop shut. Okay, well, this is what we have to do to make it more drop shut. You know, can we fudge on this to make it happen so that people spend more money on it?
Right.
And I think
that's the thing, right? Like, we is charging more money now, and people think it's worth it because, like, they're more drop shutty, right? They're better now. But, like, that's the thing is, like, are you achieving what people want by compromising something else? Because if yes, then it's not good in my opinion, right? Whereas, like, are you achieving what people want without compromising anything? Then you've added value.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I'm gonna get to the next pocket check. You got to be careful because, like, I'll go off on tangents all day, but you probably know that. This one comes from Nick T. Nick T is carrying the High Grain Designs DeVille, and that's got to be like, that was one of those knives that I wish that I had gotten in on last year. The money didn't line up with the timing. It is what it is. But that is gorgeous. High Grain Designs. For those who don't know, High Grain Designs does a lot of aftermarket scales and inlays. And so you know that those scales are going to be good. That one is with the Westinghouse micarta. My personal preference was actually going to be on the blue carbon fiber. I like the blue carbon fiber was one of my favorites. And then, of course, he also has the Tactile turn pen, the Renegade Hank, which is nice. The Pons. Yeah. He's got Warney Wednesday going on. He's got the Olight Arkfeld, the Banter, the Civivi Banter Warncliffe, and then I always get that one wrong. It's not a Kapara. It's a. All right. Anyways, let's see. War Room EDC. Shout out to him. He's got his own channel. If you guys don't know about him, make sure to go check him out. Only subscribe, guys, if you like the content. If you subscribe and you don't watch, YouTube actually penalizes channels for that. Believe it or not. That's why I don't do any. That's why I don't do channel raids anymore. When I found out it was negatively affecting people, I was like, you know what? Not worth it. War Room EDC's got a nice carry. He's got the TKL Piranha. He's got the Paramilitary 2 Warncliffe and the Delica Warncliffe. Very nice. I like that.
Yeah. You know, on that High Grain EDC, it's so interesting seeing what people think about Chinese OEM knives in terms of not like the geopolitical ethics, but like what people think the profit margins are or aren't. That's such an interesting thing to me. Because like the arguments people make are just like fascinating. Like there's so many things that they do consider correctly and then also like don't consider at all. Like for example, dealer margins are like massive. Like I don't think people understand like how much money dealers take if someone uses a dealer. They're taking 30% minimum.
Yeah. Well, you know, something that I think is really interesting, and you know, I'll shout out Lefty EDC again. He was talking about, at one point he was talking about, you know, like people get upset that our knives are made in China and they want us to do more American OEMs. It's really hard to get a good US OEM that is reliable. A lot of times they don't deliver on times. There's issues with prototyping. And it's just not worth the hassle. But meanwhile, Lefty's I say lefty, Devo knives having their knives made in China, but most of the profit is going to United States. Like, and it's not so rare to see that because, like, for example, I've got one of my favorite knives from last year is the Devo Tallboy. Camo carbon fiber. Camo carbon is a American company. It's using crucible steel. And when I asked Kev about it, he said that I think it was something like 65 to 70% of the money for the sale of each knife was basically going to the United States. Mm-hmm. And so Kubi only kept 30%. Like, Kubi's cut was basically 30% after it was all said and done. And everything else was going to some American company or other. And I thought that was really interesting because, you know, nowadays we're staring down the barrel at tariffs, right? And everything's about to cost more. And it's not looking any better. Like, it seems like every week the tariff on China goes up. And whether or not you agree with that in a political sense, you know, I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, you know, these Chinese companies, they're going to have to either eat the cost of the tariff, which some might. The prices on those knives are going to go up. I would be willing to bet that even if the price goes up to account for the tariff, that they'll probably still be less expensive than American made knives in general. But what are your thoughts on that, Brian?
Yeah, like, sure. So completely divorced from the politics of it and just talking about like how it affects the knife industry and the market in the knife industry. Because I don't have political opinions really that are worth sharing. Like, I don't really follow the news. I work all day. But I do think about like how this affects the knife industry. So broadly speaking, like, and I don't know how tariffs affect the economy or anything. I'm not an economist. I didn't go to school for that. Like, I don't know. I'm just talking about the knife industry. I think that in like short term speaking, tariffs are probably going to be good for the long term health of the knife industry and the market. Not because I think it'll make things more expensive, and like, you know, it might hurt the economy and like whatever, then that's bad for you overall, whatever. I don't know, right? But I think the key part is that a lot of the knife industry there's a big problem with oversaturation right now. And particularly a lot of that comes from Chinese OEMs. They just make so much stuff so quickly. And I don't think that we have a big enough community to sustain that at the prices that they're charging for and the quantities that they're putting out. Like, there has to be some balance of like supply and demand, and there's too much supply at the moment. And so what I think is going to happen is that, and I don't think this is the intention behind the tariffs. I just think this is because I think like people like the higher ups are not thinking about the knife community. Like, we're too small. But I think what ends up happening is that as the price of importing products goes up, less people are going to start brands and like go to Chinese OEMs, which means just less people, you know, pumping knives out. I think that the people who have the passion for knives, like Lefty and Devo, are going to stick around, and that's good. And you know, even if they make less money per knife, right? Like, I don't know who's going to eat it, whether China eats it like you suggested, or they eat the cost, right? I don't think they can sustain raising the price by the amount the tariffs are, though, and like people would still buy the knives. I think the price would just be too much for the average consumer. And so what I think will happen is that, you know, it'll weed out the people who aren't as dedicated and aren't as passionate about actually designing and making knives. And I think that's generally good for the longevity of the market.
Yeah. You know, that's a great point, because the saturation is there. And I think that, you know, there's only so much that we can look at the same knife, you know, made by 3 different companies called 3 different things and be like, okay, like, even if it is well made, we've seen this so many times. You know, I think that can actually wear people out. Yeah. I get excited when I see stuff that seems different, even if it's not super unique, because it's so hard to have a unique design these days. You know, like we'll go back to this. We were joking about this earlier, the Jot Sing costless. Yeah. Nobody's making this.
I've also talked about something a lot, which is the problem with instant gratification. When you can get what you want too easily, you burn out quicker. It's just like, I'm just buying stuff all the time. Like, it's not as special. there is something to be said about having to wait for something, and this is psychologically studied, right? Is like delayed gratification and its connection to like happiness and fulfillment. Like the knives that I took a while to be able to get are the knives that I value the most and got the most joy out of.
100%, dude. Like,
Yeah.
Today, my carry, you know, since we're on the pocket check, my carry was this guy. This is the Drop Point Umnumzon. I wanted this for, okay, so I wanted this for years. I probably started actively looking for about a year. And for me, it was always the trick of not just finding it available, but also having the money and also, you know, clicking add to cart fast enough when I did have the money, because, you know, when I'm always trying to find something new for the channel. And I have to be very strategic with my funds, because basically, you know, the funds from the channel support the hobby and then the hobby supports the channel. So it's kind of like, you know, an Ouroboros situation going on.
Right.
So for me, like, I can't always afford to wait too long. You know, I live in Colorado. My bills are ridiculous. Like, probably not as bad as California, but probably not necessarily that far away either. And so like my day job pays for my day-to-day, the channel pays for the hobby. So for me, like, I was hunting this guy for a while, the better part of over a year actively. I had notifications set up everywhere, you know, like and it's one of those things where, you know, this is not an Utzler duck or duckling. Those are even crazier to get a hold of, I think, from what I've seen. I haven't hunted one yet, but it's on my list. And I got to say, like, I've had this for a couple months now, and I still love the crap out of it. And every time I pick it up, I just remember that journey, you know, like the hunt, I think, is half the fun of getting one of these. And this isn't a custom, but it does bring me to a comment. You have a question in the chat. Sever7 says, Brian, what are a few of your favorite custom knife makers?
Sure. So top one would be Mitch Clark of Clark Handmade Knives. Excellent maker, impossible to get his knives pretty much. I happen to have a book spot though, so that's awesome. But yeah, pretty much impossible to get. South African maker. You know, and then, you know, not no particular order, my other favorites would be Jerry McGinnis of McGinnis Knives. I like Cody Utzler's knives. I like Tomas of GTK Grind Tactical Knives. And let me think. I want to name 5, so that was 4. Let's see. One more would be I really like Meads, Meades, Tice Meads, yeah, and then maybe like Hawk, Siebert, and Strickers. So yeah, that's a bunch right there.
Yeah, you know, I'm not actually familiar with Meads. I had to pull it up when you mentioned it because I'm not super familiar. For me, I've always wanted to get a custom knife from Gustavo T. Cecchini, GTC. Mm-hmm. And I don't like, he's one of those, you know, outside of the US knife makers. He outsources his designs to, you know, like he did the We Solid with We Knife Company. He worked with ZT.
Right.
And it killed me on the inside when ZT said, you know what, we can't afford to make the knives as nice as we were. And so they basically killed their custom shop, or whatever shop was putting out the super high quality knives that they were doing. And I wish that companies like ZT would realize, you know, like when you do that, you're essentially taking a knife and you're sticking it into the lifeline of your business, because you're telling your customers that you can't afford to give them what they came for initially. And
yeah, and that's the tough part, right? I think that's related to the people have unrealistic expectations of the prices that they're willing to pay for American stuff. I don't think people fully realize like what, because there's the common arguments of why Chinese knives are cheaper than American knives, but I think people don't really understand how severe it is. Let me give you the most concrete example I can give you. Let me just grab something real quick. So, this is a piece of steel This is a blank that is going to become a reblade. Okay. All this is I bought a sheet of steel and they wire EDM the profile out. This is not heat treated. It's not double disc ground. This is just a piece of steel that's cut out the rough shape. Okay. I haven't even started making the knife yet. Just this piece of steel right here costs $60. That is more than a civivi knife costs in its final form with the blade and the handle, heat treated, ground, sharpened, and everything. That's the difference between America and China. So like the cost for me to not even start making the knife yet is higher than the cost of a Chinese factory producing a completed knife. So people have unrealistic expectations of what's possible. And so when they say that ZT's charging too much, I'm like, but you don't know how expensive it is to make.
Oh, I think we lost Brian there. Hold on. We'll get Brian back. Hold on a second. All right. You're back, Brian. I think we lost you there for a second.
Okay, yeah. But that's all I wanted to say is just like, yeah, like it's so much more expensive to do things here than people really realize, I think.
Well, you know, for me, like I look at it and, you know, hold on. I'll pull up the it's the 00. Yeah, it's this one right here. So like this is one of my grail knives that I don't know if I'll ever have a chance to get because people that own them rarely put them up for sale. This is the zero tolerance ZT0055. I always forget the numbers. It's got the SLT flipper, which I think is an ingenious design. And it was a design that's ahead of its time. Now, some people will look at this and be like, oh, I don't really care for that, you know, Tanto compound ground, you know, blade. It looks weird, you know, it looks futuristic. But the amount of design that went into this, like, look at this. Not only are the handle scales contoured, but there's several different milling surfaces and 2 different textures. And so when you talk about the cost to make something like this, you know, like my point is that ZT isn't doing work like this anymore. And to your point,
and that knife came out a long time ago. So
and
that
knife came out a long time ago. And but this is what ZT was doing, and this is the kind of knife that really built their following, because for the longest time they had this cult following, and then they just kind of died, and they died when they cut their I'm going to call it their custom shop or their high performance shop, whatever division they had that was producing knives like this. Because now, like, you look at their stuff and yes, they're still well made, but the level of production isn't nearly as impressive in my opinion. You know, like there's a difference between making a knife well and making it impressively. And this is one of those that they made impressively. And it's not just this, you know, when they did the Matrix or the Matrix or the ZT, what was it? The 0777 ZT 0777. Or is it this 0777? Or maybe it was the 0770. It was the one that they did in competition with Microtech.
To support your point, really, I do think that ZT has made a critical market and business mistake. In that, so I know the reason why they did it is that, so you know how they had certain lines where like they had designs with Dmitry Sinkovich, with Emerson, etc., and they basically like pivoted away from all that to do in-house designs. And the reason for that is because they were paying massive royalties to these designers because they're massive names, right? And so they wanted to sort of take in all that profit margin for themselves by excluding the designer and just coming up with their own in-house designs. The problem is the reason why those designers command that amount of money and respect is because their designs are good. And so ZT's in-house designs have been pretty weak lately, if we're being frank. Like they're not very complex. Like nobody's really in love with any of them. Like there's no GTC design. There's no Sinkovich design. There's like these instant classics. Like they're not coming out with these sorts of designs because they never came up with those themselves to begin with.
Yeah, you know, I look at their stuff and I'm like, there's something that's missing. And you look at their older work, like on the screen right now, I've got it's the 0777. I always get that mixed up with the 0770 because it's basically like the 0770 is like a 2D version of the 0777. And it was a knife that they made, and it's very similar to the microtech matrix.
Right.
And I did a review on the Reich version. I'll call it the Reccomended because it was microtech's Reich OEM matrix. And the story, I'm sure you're familiar, but for those who aren't, Kershaw/ZT went up to Tony Marfione at a blade show, and they showed him a knife, and they said, "We bet you can't make this better than we can." And Tony Marfione, of course, said, "Let's find out." And so they both made versions, and they both put them out to the public. And the general consensus, apparently the general consensus was that people liked the microtech matrix more. And then, of course, Kershaw/ZT went ahead and sued microtech.
Yeah.
And that's why, and so they had it was a subliner lock. So Kershaw ended up putting a utility patent on the subliner lock directly after that. So microtech had to respond by changing their design slightly so that it wasn't infringing on the patent. And stories like that are crazy cool to me, but we get to reap the benefits of that, seeing two at the time amazing knife makers go at it, knife companies go at it, and ultimately when that happens, we win. The consumer wins.
I want to make a note on that, actually. I feel like that competition. So divorced from the ethics of copying something, right? I just want to talk about that competitiveness, that desire to be better than your immediate competition, right? What's happened to that? No one's trying anymore.
Well, yeah. Well, competition is kind of like the caboose that motivates people to be better, just for the sake of pride in what you do. And I look at the 0777. God, I hate their naming schemes. And I look at that, I'm like, that looks like an inspired design. That looks like a design that they tried on. And then, if you look at what came after, which is the ZT 0770, by comparison, it looks like a shadow of itself. So the 0770, you can still see my screen, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the 0770. It's flat. They kept the pivot. There's no additional, the pocket clip looks like they just, gave up. And I'm sure the knife is well made, but I look at this, I'm like, how could you in good conscience buy this when what you really want is something that they're not willing to make anymore? And what they told the public was, well, we're not able to, for us to make it, we'd have to charge so much, and people wouldn't want to pay for it. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But knives like the Cortex XL exist. Knives like the Machine Wise Mojave exist. People pay plenty of money for these. Plenty of money for these.
It's tough because there's two aspects to this. The first one is people are more willing to pay for small batch stuff as opposed to any production company gets the production tax. Where basically they're like, oh, you're a factory, so you should be able to do it for no money, which is not really true. They have more overhead and stuff like that. The other aspect of it, which is, how do I put this? People have a tendency to pick the best example that suits their argument, that supports their argument, not the best example that represents their argument. So let me give you an example. So I've seen some people criticize the price of Jack Wolf knives, and the comparison that they give is American Blade Works. They'll say American Blade Works can come out with an American-made slip joint for $100. How can Jack Wolf justify a $300 Chinese slip joint, right? And it's interesting to me because, there's so many factors involved here. These are not one-to-one comparisons in any stretch of the imagination. But most importantly, American Blade Works doesn't charge, how do I say this? it's almost a subsidized business. It's not, but I'm just saying it's almost a subsidized business in the sense that he's made his money through a different career. He's an older guy now. He's not in the knife making thing purely to like sustain himself and make profit and like run a business there. Like a lot of it is passion, and my term for it is called passion pricing, where basically you try to give people the best price that you can because you're able to. Not the most business optimal price for like generating a profit margin that can, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. He's not trying to build a business and like make the most profit possible in a capitalistic sense. He's trying to like do this out of passion for like knife making and like make some money, but like not as much as he could.
He wants to keep it rolling. He wants people to be able to experience his knives.
Exactly. So there's that aspect of it. And I don't think it's fair to compare one person's passion pricing with another person's, like, this is their livelihood pricing.
You know, speaking of American knife makers, you know, when you mentioned the passion pricing, have you ever heard of Vulcan Knives? I
have not.
So Vulcan Knives, I'll send them to you on Instagram. I thought when I first found out about it, it was mentioned to me during a live stream like this by a channel member, and they're like, "Oh, you've got to check out Vulcan Knives." And I looked at it, I was like, "This has got to be a scam," because American-made custom knives, like this guy works basically out of his garage. He's retired, and we're talking like custom folding knives with crossbar style locks and like, you know, heat treated like Magna Cut and steel that I've never heard of. Oh no, we lost Brian again. Hold on. We'll see if we can get Brian back. Anyways, steel that I've never heard of. Here we go.
I'm back.
Welcome back. But I was talking about Vulcan Knives, and it's so like we're talking high Rockwell hardness target steel, like ZDP 189. He uses like Z-Max Ultras, crazy steels, crossbar style locks, folding knives, carbon fiber, titanium, milling, the whole nine. And we're talking like these are custom knives that he's selling for like $200 to $400. $200 to $400. And the people, like, his stuff sells. He just sells it on Instagram. And I reached out to him, you know, like I wouldn't have bothered if he hadn't been mentioned by someone I trusted as part of my channel membership. I would have just thought it was a scam. And then his knives started popping up in people's pocket checks. I'm like, what the hell's going on here? So I reached out to him. I'm like, how is this possible? How are you able to make these knives custom, handmade for a lot of stuff? You know, I think he does have a mill, but I don't know if it's a full CNC or what he's got going on. If it's like a hand mill, I'm not sure. Yeah. So I reached out to him, like, how is this possible? Like, nobody's doing custom premium folding knives at this price tag. How do you do it? He says, well, I'm not really trying to make money. I do this for fun because I enjoy doing it. And so when you mentioned the passion pricing, you know, that makes a lot of sense. You know, a company like Jack Wolf, and I'll raise my hand. I've been slightly critical of their pricing too. I wouldn't use American Blade Works as the litmus test because that is an outlier, you know?
Right. Like, you should be comparing to like other Chinese knives of similar quality, for example.
I will say this though. And I've talked to other channels who swear by Jack Wolf knives, and I've reviewed a few. The quality of the tolerances on Jack Wolf knives are really good. The issue that I have with pricing for Jack Wolf knives is that he's not willing to disclose the OEM. Now, I said it before, no matter who makes it, what we care most about is that it's made well, you know, but to the person who isn't, you know, the knife channel checking out 100 knives a month, you know, are they really going to be able to tell the difference in quality between something like, you know, a QSP Hedgehog, you know, for example, I actually have one here on the table, QSP Hedgehog, and the quality in something like a Jack Wolf knife? And the answer to that is maybe sometimes. I have a traditional pocket knives version of this knife that comes in camo carbon fiber M390. It's a full hollow grind. One of the sliciest knives I've ever owned, period. It cuts really well. The walk and talk is amazing. But that knife, with all of those premium materials, great walk and talk, and, you know, quality that the average consumer would never be able to tell the difference between that and a Jack Wolf knife quality wise, the average consumer.
Right.
But that is half the price of a Jack Wolf knife. And so like when I look at that, that's when I start to say, well, you know, is the pricing fair? This is why we need to know the OEM, because you're not willing to disclose it. He says it's not Rayot or Riot. And, but who is it? Like,
yeah, I don't know personally. Obviously, like, you know, he hasn't shared that with anyone. So there's a few things. So I would say that like Jack Wolf is at the upper end of his pricing, really, of what could be reasonable. Like he's probably like maxed out like what could be like what he could charge for his knives.
Yeah.
Then there's the aspect for like very elaborate packaging.
That's true.
And then there's the fact that he sells everything through dealers, which, like I said, they take 30%. And obviously, the more expensive a knife is, the more money 30% is. You know what I mean?
Well, so I thought it was funny. I did a video on the Gunslinger, and you know, it wasn't a knife that he sent me. It was a knife that was loaned to me by another channel. And I mentioned in it that I was kind of disappointed that it was $350 for the Gunslinger, but we didn't also get a slip, you know, because on the $300 slip joints we got a slip, you know, and I get that, you know, you get a pocket clip, but it would have been a nice touch, you know, for $350 to also get a slip. He replied to the video, which is great. You know, I love finding out when designers, makers, and companies actually watch my content. That's always nice. But yeah. He was like, we couldn't possibly do that. You know, like the margins for this or this, we can't sell, you know, these locking knives for less than what we're selling them for. I think it was like 2 weeks later, every single retailer that sold Jack Wolf knives, the locking knives, had them going for like $230, $250. It's like the timing on that is perfect. What do you mean you can't do this? You know, obviously, I'm imagining that at that price, it's the dealer that's really the one taking the hit. But Jack Wolf knife,
yeah, they'd be the one taking the hit.
Because you know, Jack Wolf is obviously, they're setting the map agreements that everyone has to agree to on the pricing. So, you know, one company doesn't undercut another. But I just thought it was interesting, you know, that on one hand, he's telling me that, no, we can't sell them for this cheap. And then the next week, everyone's selling them that cheap.
Yeah. So there's, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just about to say, like, we had a comment in here. Hold on. This one's from Todd Carr. He says, Jack Wolf Knives is definitely making max profit. That's for sure. But same as any knife company, they sell for what people are willing to pay for them, period. And that's what it all comes down to. Something is only worth what somebody else is willing to pay. So it doesn't matter how much the profit margin is. You know, I think that consumers, you know, we always want to pay what the maker spent to make it. But if we only ever paid the cost of something, there would be no businesses. We wouldn't have any products to buy because people still need to make a profit.
So it's interesting because there's a psychological element to knowing what the profit margin is on something, which does affect the perception of the value and therefore what people are willing to pay. So if let's say hypothetically, like, so I charge $290 base for my reblade, right? If I told you that $280 of that was profit and I only spent $10 making it, that would affect your perception of whether or not it's worth $290, right? So you might not be willing to pay it anymore, even if you were initially. So this is where, like, you know, I think that information is important. Like, the more information, the more well-informed your decision is most of the time. So yeah, like, to some extent, I agree with, like, you know, knowing the OEM, knowing the cost of manufacturing, knowing all that, like, helps you make a more informed and therefore more accurate evaluation of the cost of the knife, or what its true cost of value should be. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, you know, I think that most knife enthusiasts like a certain level of transparency. Like, I don't need to know what We Knife Company spends to make a knife. But I do like knowing what companies are involved in the OEM work, because it gives me some level of assurance. You know, most people aren't going to knife shows to decide if they're going to buy a knife or not. You know, a lot of times we watch YouTube reviews, we do as much research as we can, and then we buy one, and you know, we hope that once it finally gets to us in the mail that it's everything we hoped it would be, you know?
Right.
And so that's why I think transparency is important, because we don't have all the facts. It's not like, you know, going to a dealership. Some people live in towns where there is a brick and mortar store that they can walk in and try something out. But a lot of those brick and mortar stores don't have the greatest availability. So I think that's why the transparency is important. You know, typically speaking, when there's a well-known reputable company behind the OEM work, there's a certain level of quality that I can come to expect. And it's not always there. You know, sometimes, you know, we get let down, we expect something and it's, you know, just doesn't happen. And I think that sometimes that falls on the design itself instead of the OEM. But I think that when you're spending that much money, there is a certain level of transparency that's important. I will say this.
Yeah.
Jack Wolf Knives has earned the people's trust, because if you talk to people who know slip joints really well, you know, specifically on their slip joints, their locking knives, I think, are priced fairly for the quality that you get. But on the slip joints, that seems to be what is most contentious for a lot of people, is the pricing on those, because $300 for a slip joint is expensive. It's very expensive for a slip joint. But when you talk to people that know about that, and they know about the tolerances and the quality, it's pretty unrivaled. There's not a whole lot of companies that do slip joints that well. I just don't know if it's worth it specifically to me when I can go and pick up a QSP Hedgehog that, you know, my untrained eye will look at and say, well, the tolerances on here seem perfect to me. I can get it in premium materials for half the price. And I think that that's the rub for a lot of people is that if they can't tell, why would they want to spend the extra? But
so two things there. So the first thing I would say is, it's like wine. So like I like wine, but I like cheap wine just as much as expensive wine, because I can't tell the difference. Does that mean that the expensive wine isn't worth more? Right. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I want to say this. So like, my name is Transparent Knives, right? Like, obviously I value transparency, but I will say that transparency without education is actually dangerous. If you share information without context and people understanding what that information means, it can actually be damaging. So if I say, for example, that it's starting to echo, by the way, real quick. But what was I? Oh yeah. So if I say, for example, that, oh, hey, you know, it costs me $42 to do wire EDM, right? Which is my cost for wire EDMing one blank. Someone might take that information and go to another person and say, well, why does your knife cost this much if it only cost Brian $42 to wire EDM? Well, that's because in a different state, in a different location, it might cost them $80, literally double.
Yeah.
Now, that's not fair, right? Because that, like, you're assuming that because my profit margin is X because my wire EDM cost is less, that someone else's profit margin must be equivalently larger because they're charging $40 more. But really, their wire EDM cost might just be $40 more, and they're not making any extra profit compared to me. And so that's, you know what I mean? Like, there can be examples of like unfairness that come from transparency as long as if people don't know the full context.
Right. And it's not, and you're right, it's not fair to hold someone else to a standard that's being set somewhere else. You know, it's that you have a good point there. Real quick, we got a $5 super from TC Blades. Shout out to TC Blades. He says, we all complain about what Benchmade charges for what they deliver, yet they charge what they do because everyone is willing to pay it. So Benchmade, I think it was on Cole's live stream, Tri-State's live stream. They were looking at what knife companies were making like in the last year, and Benchmade blew everyone away. They blew away Spyderco. They blew away Kershaw. Like they crushed everybody. But Benchmade, here's the thing though. Benchmade has more retail store connections. Like, I'm talking big box retailers like REI. They've got military contracts. So something that I want to mention is, like, yes, people are willing to pay for it, but the people who are willing to pay for it isn't necessarily the super enthusiast community that are hyper focused on knives. People that I see buying Benchmades right now are like gun people who absolutely, like, there's a certain section of the gun community that will tell you all day, oh, Benchmade is amazing. Benchmade is amazing. I actually think that Benchmade has fallen back a step recently when the ownership change happened. And it seemed like they were spending more money on lawsuits, on their, litigations than they were on designing new stuff. We've recently seen Benchmade come out with a lot of old retired designs that were fan favorites, but not necessarily executing the way that the older original models were. That's just my thoughts on that. So TC Blades, thank you for the $5 super. He says, we all complain about what Benchmade charges for what they deliver, yet they charge what they do because everyone is willing to pay it. I agree. I don't know about everyone, because I know that specifically within the enthusiast community, they've lost a lot of traction, but they've been doing really well in their retail connections, and they do a good job of maintaining their government contracts and protecting what they claim is their IP through litigation. But that's just my 2 cents on that.
Benchmade is a tough example because it's just not. There's no comparison. They're the largest knife company. Like, they pay so much on marketing and legal expenses, like you said. Like, they're just a completely different animal. Like, the way that they run their business, it's not for enthusiasts really anymore. It's really for like that broad hunter market, whatever, things like that. And so, they're really running a different business. And so people think of most knife companies as like, what does it cost to make the knife? That's not the cost of a Benchmade. The cost of a Benchmade is, what does it cost to promote the knife? What is the cost of the marketing? They spend more on marketing than like every other company combined. They have a larger Instagram following than even Blade HQ. Like, they have the largest Instagram following period in knives. So I don't think of Benchmade as like, what does it cost for them to make a knife? I'm like, what does it cost for them to make the knife, pay for overhead, and pay for marketing? Right. Like, it's just different. No, it is way different. And, real quick, I've been showcasing the pocket checks as we go, because I just think it's nice to have these up here. A shout out to Kevin Smith with this awesome pocket check. He's got the Spyderco Shaman with the rock scale design scales. He's got a Manix 2. I'm not sure if this is a lightweight or not because of the original goat scales that are on there. It might be a lightweight. And then, of course, a Para 3. And I think, are those Barclay EDC? Are those Barclay EDC scales? It might be, with that diamond pattern there. I think that's the Draco's armor. Which one? The middle one?
No, the one on the far right, the Para 3.
Oh, I think it is Barclay.
Is that Barclay? Dude, Barclay is amazing. I found out about them last year, and they're fantastic. I feel kind of bad because Instagram has been absolutely killing their business lately. They used to do all of their business on Instagram, and you look at the reach they've had recently, and it's gone way downhill. Anyways, that's from Kevin Smith and Knives, and I zoomed way out. Oh, real quick, hey, shout out to Aiden Miguel with the $20 super. Thank you, man. He says, support the makers willing to work with super steels and deliver better quality than what most companies, Benchmade specifically, puts out. Yeah, so I was talking to Brian about this before the show started. I jumped off the deep end recently. Like, I've done several knife sales because I got tired of talking about it and not actually experiencing it. So, like, this is a recent buy from Machine Wise. Shout out to Matt D, channel member, who sold me this beautiful Craig Brown Cortex XL. These are knives that last year around this time, I just wouldn't have had the money to make it happen. But because you guys are so generous and you participated in my knife sales, I was able to make it happen. And I got to say that, will I stop buying and carrying less expensive knives? No. I love knives of all price ranges, but there's officially a special place in my heart for knives that are made with extremely high quality, like the Machine Wise Mojave and like the Craig Brown Cortex XL. Like these have lit a fire that I can't put out now. And
yeah.
Like Brian, like I see your videos, man, with the Cody Utzler knives. Like you get to experience a lot of things too. If you're a knife enthusiast, I'm going to say this to anybody who's watching who hasn't taken that plunge off the deep end yet. If you're a knife enthusiast and knives bring you joy and you're like, I don't know how to make it happen, save up, experience a knife on the higher end, like a true mid-tech. And I'm not even necessarily saying full custom, because some full customs are not necessarily like as good as production knives when we're talking about the overall quality, because a lot of the like true customs are handmade and there's only so much you can do handmade. But I think that at some point everyone should try to experience a knife like this. The amount of joy that you get out of it is amazing, and you get to support these small batch American makers, or in some cases South African makers, or great knives can be made all over the world. But I think that the more we support those, the stronger the foundation of the knife community itself is.
I completely agree. And one thing to consider is this is an argument I made before, but like, so similar to like how Metal Complex has said many times that like gas station knives are copying the real thing, right? Well, custom knives are really what set the market. They're what create the demand. They're what sets like, this is what's cool. Okay. Now, then production says, okay, that's what's cool. We're going to bring it to the wider market, right? It is very important that these smaller makers who come up with like cool designs, because let's be real, like if you left production companies to their own devices, they would just come out with the same thing over and over again. That's what production does.
Right.
It's when custom makers are basically the ones who set the market trends, or like create like the innovations and changes that people want to see. And then that trickles down to production. And so it's very important to support that aspect of the knife market, in my opinion, because otherwise, like you'll just have civivi for the rest of your life. Like, and there's nothing wrong with civivi, right? Like civivi is great, right, but like in their quality, but they're not setting the market trends, They're
not pushing the limits.
Right.
Right.
And that's not their job to either.
No, they're there to hit market demand and to find a way to make something that everyone likes and make it affordably or attainable, and on that note, we mentioned before, like companies that have OEM work done in Taiwan, but nobody knows, the name of the Taiwanese company. A good example of that is this guy right here. This is the Quiet Carry 9. And I've talked to several people who have fallen way deeper down the rabbit hole of knife collecting than I have. I have now experienced knives in a ton of different price ranges. And every time I get something that I feel like raises the bar, to bring me back down to earth, I pick up this knife, because this knife is incredibly well made. Contoured handle scales. We got, 3D knurling, texturing. We've got contoured inlays. People don't understand just how tough that is to do, to have a contoured titanium handle scale and then also perfectly contour a carbon fiber inlay into that and have it fit and work well. The level of machine work that has to exist to make that happen this accurately is impressive, in my opinion. Throw in, great edge geometry. The factory edge on here is stupidly sticky. They did it amazing. It's one of the best factory edges that I've experienced. And, it brings me to the topic of diminishing returns. This is one of those knives that I think is a cheat code, because if I'm out there and I'm like, okay, I want to buy one of the nicest, best production knives out there, but I don't want to spend $800. For me, my recommendation would be a Quiet Carry 9. You can get them in a couple different variations, and you're still spending a decent amount of money. These are $365 when they're available, and they go available every, at least once a month or every couple of months. So that would be my recommendation for, this is kind of the ceiling. If you don't necessarily care if it's made in the United States, made in Taiwan is pretty good too, of course. But what would your suggestion be for, kind of the diminishing returns level? What would your knife suggestion be on that, Brian?
It depends on what you value, obviously, and what you consider to be like worth extra money or whatever. And that's obviously completely subjective. But for me personally, the point of diminishing returns is about $850 currently.
Really?
It used to be 800, but inflation, so 850.
Okay.
That's my point of diminishing returns. That's the point where you can get stuff like your Rosies, your Duck, your whatever, all these other like small batch, high-end production knives. I think you can get a lot at that price. I am personally willing to spend more than that because that's for like CNC makers, right? Like handmade needs to cost more. So like for a handmade knife, I'm willing to pay more. And at that point, like I don't even see it as a diminishing return. I'm just like, this is just a different product.
So I got a question for you, and you may have heard me like rant about this on live streams in the past, but what is it about an Oz Machine Company Rosie that makes it worth the $800 plus price point? Like, and the reason I ask this is because, when I look at an Oz Machine Company Roosevelt, and then I look at something like this, like a Craig Brown Cortex XL, I feel like I see it on this, but not necessarily on the Rosie. And I'm not necessarily sure why. And I don't know if that's even fair of me to say because I haven't handled a Roosevelt yet. But I've talked to people who have, and many people say that they're just overpriced, but market has driven the price to a point where it's acceptable because it's in such high demand. But specifically from a design perspective, you've handled plenty of Rosies, like
Probably
these
over
knives
30.
inside and out. Like if you were to compare something like Craig Brown's work to Oz Machine Company's work, which would you say is more impressive? Instead of asking like, do you think it's worth it? Because I like that question is played out. It's worth it because people are willing to pay for it. But if you were to like, for example, which do you think is more impressive? Craig Brown's work or Oz Machine Company?
I don't want to use the word impressive. I'm going to say that the Brown is more value.
Really?
Yeah. So impressive just depends. Because they're impressive in very different ways. That's why I don't want to compare the impressiveness. I think they're both like well made, right? And like,
sure.
But they're made completely different. Like Craig Brown's are hand ground, for example. That's whereas like Oz's are machine ground but hand finished, but with stones, right? So so it's hard to say which one's more impressive because they both do both of those things well, but they're just different things. Sorry. But what I will say is that I think that the Craig Browns are about priced where they need to be, or where they should be. I should say not need to, but should. I think that Rosies are very slightly overpriced. Not like crazy. Like I wouldn't like. It's not worth complaining about. But
sure.
I do think that they're like probably a little bit. So whereas like a Craig Brown, I think he priced it perfect. Say the Rosie is like a little bit higher than like perfect. If just for me personally, the way I evaluate knives and value, I would say that an example of a knife that's undervalued is the Duck. The amount of work that goes into making a Duck, I think, is a little bit higher than both of those knives, and this is $850, by the way. So it just depends, and the types of things I'm looking for when I'm evaluating this value is like the amount of extra work that goes into the blade finishing, how thin they're getting the knives, like the heat treat. The tolerances in ways that people usually don't measure. So, for example, like pivot place, stuff like that. And also another thing I need to point out: I've handled over 30 of each of these knives. I didn't just handle one Cortex or one Rosie or one Duck. I've handled literally dozens of these knives, and so I'm also considering the consistency from knife to knife. Because that matters, right? Because not every customer is going to experience the same thing, right? Like 2 people might get a Rosie, and they're very consistent overall, but 2 people might get a Rosie, and like one might be like the one I currently have in my Pelican case, where I'm like, this is like one of the best Rosies I've ever had, and then one might be like one of the worst Rosies I've ever had, right? And like they're going to say very different things, right? And so yeah.
So I guess that. while you're touching on that, Blade Lab, shout out to Blade Lab, he has the comment, part of the reason brown may have higher value is that he just has lower volume and more designs.
I think that's what drives the market value more. But I don't care about market value at all. So like, I know like people always say it's worth what people are willing to pay, whatever. I completely disagree. I don't believe in the it's worth what people are willing to pay at all. I believe that you can convince someone with good marketing that something is worth more. Does that mean that the product is better now? Like, no, like it just means that you have better marketing, right? And so the what your product is worth is partially it can't be dog shit. But like a lot of it comes down to how you market, how you advertise, how you convince people psychologically that it's worth it. And that I don't care about because I kind of want to feel like I can see through a lot of that and like look at the knife for what it is and what the quality is. So, because like people are willing to pay ridiculous money for like terrible things sometimes. Like, let's be honest. Like, and so it's just like, let's be like dead honest.
Right.
Like, if you could sit that person down, have a heart to heart, and show them like what's really going on here, like maybe they would change their minds. Doesn't mean that the product changed though. It's physically the same product. It's just that their mental perception of it has changed because you gave them more information.
Well, that's really interesting because to me, like I look at this hobby, like how much joy does it bring me? Like, why do we have a hobby in the first place? Because it brings us joy, because we enjoy doing it, because it makes us feel like we're a part of something, and it gives us something to talk about with like-minded friends, right? So for me, oftentimes, like I'll give an example. Like when I talk about knives that I think are really well made, since I have it on the desk, I used to do something called grailer garbage, and I don't know if you ever saw those videos or not, but I have. Yeah. I attempted. It didn't. I'll say this: like, I didn't figure out the secret sauce to really make it fair, because there were times where I would look at a knife and I'd be like, I don't really enjoy this knife, but based on my rating system, it rates really high. And then there was a knife like this where based on that rating system, it didn't score very high, but it brought me more joy. Like I got way more joy out of this than I did out of a knife that scored higher. And I couldn't explain it. And so I think that when we talk about value or worth, a lot of times we have to experience it to know. I initially, like I didn't understand that this was initially the regular Cortex, not the XL, but the regular Cortex is contoured. I place a lot of value on that because I just find contoured handle scales to be more comfortable. The more comfortable it is, the more likely I am to put it in my pocket and to carry it. And, I'm one of those guys that'll carry everything that they own because that's how I get the most enjoyment out of it. Some people will look at that and be like, you're absolutely out of your freaking gourd carrying that knife. Yeah. Put it in a case. How are you going to tell Reddit that you didn't cut or carry? So for me, like I look at it, it's worth it if it brings you that much joy and you have no buyer's remorse. If you get it in the mail, no matter how much it costs, whether it costs $50 or $1,000, if you get it in the mail and you have buyer's remorse after you open it and you hold it and you check it out, it wasn't worth it. Even if the material composition was there, it doesn't matter what it costs if it doesn't bring you the enjoyment that you were aiming for when you press the buy button.
For sure.
And so that's why it goes back to market demand. The demand has been brought up. People have a certain level of expectation for how much enjoyment is it going to bring you. And then they get it. And for me, I ask these questions because I have a very aggressive grail list this year. I mentioned it in the last live stream, but I want to experience Cody Utzler's work. I want to experience an Oz Machine Company Roosevelt. I still haven't experienced a Konigarius, which many people tout as like the bee's knees of high-end production knives or mid-tech or whatever you want to call it.
In some ways it's very nice. Yes.
Yeah. I want to check out skiff made blades. Like none of these are cheap. Right. So for me, I look at this like, what do I need to prioritize to have the least amount of disappointment as I possibly can?
There's two ways to look at it. The first way is you want to handle the worst stuff first, because then when you handle the best stuff, you're like, whoa, it's so good, right? And then the other way to look at it is you want to handle the best stuff first, so you have the perspective of what is good, so you can judge the stuff that isn't as good.
You know, I think
And
that's
I don't
a
think
good
there's
way.
a right. Yeah, I don't think there's a wrong answer. I'm just saying, like,
Right, right. Well, I mean, I think that, you know, you take a chance on those knives, because I've seen it where people will buy an Arius and they'll be like, this was garbage. Like, I don't know why I spent it. You know, turn and burn, get it away from me. I can't believe I bought this. And then some people will stand by it and they'll be like, not only did I buy one, I bought three, and here's my Koenig Arius display case. And so, you know, I think it's one of those where you just have to experience it. But the good news is that when we're talking about knives like that, or like, you know, the Machine Wise Mojave, or the, you know, the anything from Cody Utzler, or is it Utzler or Utzler?
I actually do not know.
I've heard that it's supposed to be like Utz and not you. I don't know.
I think you're supposed to say Utzler, but I also know that he doesn't really care that much. So
Perfect. The good news is that when you buy something like this, if you don't like it, you can turn around and sell it and get your money back and try something else. That's the nice part, is that, you know, if you buy it like a Civivi Elementum and you don't like it, you turn around to sell it, you open the box. If you can't return it to the retailer immediately, it's worth 50% less.
right.
So that's one of those things that I think is kind of nice, is that, you know, when you might be taking a chance on a more expensive knife, but if you don't like it, you know, you have full recourse to turn around, sell it, and get your money back. Hey, shout out to Renee Ramon for the $5 super. He says, Roll, thanks for having TK on. I love his work and can't wait to get mine. Great opinions and takes from both of y'all tonight. Hey, thanks, man. That's what I aim for whenever I bring someone on for a live stream, is just good conversation, you know. And
So yeah, and to piggyback on a point you made earlier, you talked about how like you thought something was cool because it was contoured, right?
right.
Now that comes from your understanding that it requires more expensive equipment, so it's like, you know, there's more into it, right?
But also because it's less common, you know, like I could point to like for example, contoured handle skills. I mentioned this earlier. Contoured handle skills are more comfortable in most people's hands because, you know, it fits the contour of your hand better than something like a flat slab. You know, anytime you have a harder edge or angle, it's not going to be as comfortable as something that's rounded, right? Generally speaking. So because we don't see it as often, it's cooler when we do see it. And because it is more comfortable to hold, and a knife is something that you have to hold to use, that's personally why I place more value on it. I also had an understanding that the machinery that can create scales like this, like specifically like this, not contouring by hand where you chamfer and then sand over to get that curvature, but like where it actually 3D mills. My understanding is that 3D milling machines are way more expensive than the regular CNC milling. Now, full disclosure, I'm not a machinist. I'm an enthusiast with a microphone and a camera. So I'm not the most knowledgeable person on that. That's just what I had heard. But that's also why I'm glad that I have you on here, because I know that while I might not know all that stuff, you have a better grasp on that than I do.
So here's one thing that's interesting, like this, and this is why I think it's funny a little bit sometimes. So this is something knife makers talk about behind closed doors, but I'll just share it here. The way knife makers look at the value of a knife is based on material cost and how much work goes into it. That's it. That's how knife makers look at it. Now, there are certain things that enthusiasts currently like that are actually cheaper to do, but people give it value because they like how it looks, and they don't. I think it's partially because they don't know that it's cheaper, because if they did, it would probably affect their perception of it. So let's say like micro milling, for example. Micro milling is actually cheaper to do than a perfectly smooth contour titanium handle.
Really?
And the reason is because when you're doing the CNC tool paths, in order to do a perfectly smooth handle, like perfectly smooth, right? You have to do very, very fine steps. So that's more paths. Like you have to run over it in smaller steps. Whereas if you do larger steps, that's what leaves that micro milling. Now, Me personally, I'm not like, I'm not like super passionate about correcting people on this because I think it's fine to think that it looks cool. Like I actually think it looks cool too. But it is a fact that it is actually cheaper than a perfectly smooth scale. And so it's interesting, right? Because like then like I think in a lot of cases like the reality of what things cost affects our perception of how valuable it is sometimes. So someone finding out that it's cheaper, it might make them think, oh, I don't want textured then, or I don't want step milling anymore. And I don't think you have to feel that way. Like if you think it looks cool, like why not, right? But you might not pay extra for it if you know that it's cheaper.
For me, and I'm glad you mentioned this because I was thinking about this on the Mojave. The Mojave has what they call fine step milling, right? And it's their least expensive option. These start at 800 and they go upwards of like 875. And the more expensive ones are the ones that have like the turtle scale pattern on the handle scale.
Right.
The fine step milling is usually the least expensive. I'm not going to say cheap because at this price tag, nothing is cheap, but I enjoy it specifically because I find that it's more snail trail resistant and it gives a tactile feel to like if the handle scales were smooth, for example, Spyderco Swish Buoy, smooth handle scales, but on the knife joy version, they get snail trails like nobody's business. That is a smooth, contoured titanium handle scale, to your point. But everyone wants it to be stonewashed because they get snail trails really badly.
Right.
Whenever you have a little bit of texture like this, you get a little bit better grip on the knife, but also it's more snail trail resistant because there's less of a flat surface for whatever scratching it to have full contact with.
Also less finger oils and stuff because they go into the grooves. You don't have as much fingerprinting.
Yeah. So for me, like, I don't know if that would change my perception of it. I do think that that's really interesting though, because I also didn't know that doing smooth handle scales was more expensive. But now that you mention it like that, I'm starting to look at, like the Medford Praetorian and the Strider AR where I'm like, oh, wow, those are perfectly smooth. I wonder.
Well, so I was specifically saying for contoured because that they just double disc grind it to be smooth.
Double disc grind. Okay.
Cheaper. Yeah.
Okay.
But here's an interesting thought experiment. So let's say you have two contoured titanium knives, right? Everything is the same. Heat treats the same. Grinds the same, et cetera, et cetera. The only difference is that one of them has contoured smooth titanium handles. The other has contoured micro mill titanium handles. Okay. Now, would you be willing to pay more for the micro milled one, knowing that it's cheaper to produce, but you like it more?
I mean, I feel like knowing what I know now, maybe not.
It's tough, right? Because it's like on the one hand, that's what I want because like it has benefits like less snail trailing, less fingerprinting, and more grip. But I know it's cheaper for you to do, so it kind of affects my perception, right?
Well, not for nothing. Now that you're mentioning it, it makes me think of the Koenig Arius because the Koenig Arius, they've got two different handle scale patterns. The most expensive one is the Corda pattern, right? But they also have their standard pattern, which has the fine milling lines. Now those they're not just like a straight fluted,
right? They're patterned,
yeah, but they are patterned. But the smooth handle scale option is seen as like the baseline. But based on what you're telling me, since that is a contoured handle scale, and it takes more to get that smooth handle scale, technically speaking, it should cost more than the patterned.
Yeah, I've talked about this with a lot of friends, actually, that exact example where, like, it's funny, but, like, I think that for Koenig, a lot of it comes down to, like, they understand what people perceive to some extent. And so they're just, I think they're kind of just like, yeah, whatever. We'll just, we'll just do it the way people expect, right?
Like, oh, look at your basic one that took us like, 4 more hours to produce.
Sometimes, right? And so, like, it's just funny to think about, and makers think about this stuff. Like, behind closed doors, we say, like, yo, like, I'm about to do this thing that costs more money to do, but people think it has to be cheaper. Like, and so we start debating. We're like, should I even do it, right? Should I even do this objectively more expensive thing? Or should I do what they think is more expensive and is actually cheaper for me? Because otherwise I'm going to get criticism and, get flamed for putting in more work. Like, I'm going to do more work and people are going to criticize me. I don't want to deal with that. And you have to also consider knife makers, a lot of them don't handle criticism well. They're not like public people, you know. I'm probably an exception in that regard, where like I talk to people a lot. I'm like very open to like, you know, discussing and directly talking to people. The vast majority of custom makers, you can't get on the phone with them. They don't want to talk to you. They're very solitary. Right. They're like recluses. And so like when they see that like there's this public sentiment of like this thing that you want to do is considered cheap, they're like, yo, like, what am I doing here? Right? Like, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to get the flack. Right. So
right.
It's funny having these conversations, like, you know, with makers, because like I obviously like, especially now I have this server, this Discord server with like a bunch of makers, and I'm just like, we talk about this stuff, and I'm just like, yeah, it's kind of funny, like.
Oh man, and you know, speaking of which, I found out about your Discord server the other day. Really, really cool that you have such good resources, guys. If you didn't know, it's. Is it transparentknives.com?
That's my website.
Yeah. On your so speaking of your resources, something that I found that I really liked was your resource on hardness testing. So if you guys didn't know, Brian's got he's got a spreadsheet for HRC tests. Now, in my Steel Snobs episodes, I do a ton of research. So finding information is usually the most time-consuming part of what I do whenever I research an episode. And Brian does a ton of testing. And so the other day I was just browsing, and I found out about this. If you guys want to know about, you know, knives that have been HRC tested, there's some things that are important to know, and that is that HRC can vary, you know, from batch to batch, even with the same maker, with the same steel. Brian does a phenomenal job of categorizing and listing and recording this data. And this is really useful to someone like me that likes to fall down the rabbit hole and find out about this stuff. So for anybody that wants to kind of go further down the rabbit hole, you want to see what different knives have tested at, this is a great resource. You know, obviously other resources that I use the spreadsheet from Cedric and Ada. They have a great resource as well. But the real benefit is when you can compare them. You've done a ton of testing so far. I
have some I actually need to add. I haven't updated it in a bit.
I was going to say, like, how frequently do you add to this?
Whatever I remember, so it's completely random. Sometimes I update it as soon as I do a test. Sometimes like I'll put like 10 at once because I forgot for a while.
Nice. Well, for the record, I just wanted to tell you that if you continue to support this resource, I will continue to use it, and it might end up getting quoted in one of my Steel Snobs episodes. So just be aware.
And also, I do the hardness testing for free. People sometimes send me their knives to test. I only charge return shipping, which is like $9, small flat rate. So yeah, I always encourage people, like, if you want to know, like, I can do that, right?
Hey, that's great, man. You know, and for me, there's one reason why I don't have a indenter style tester, and that is because not just because they're expensive, but also because they take up space.
Yeah,
they take up a decent amount of space. I live in a condo. I don't have the space. My garage barely fits my car, so I don't have the space yet. But eventually, I'll get into a bigger living area, bigger living space, and I will have the space. And when that happens, I am definitely going to start saving up for one, because I think it's really cool. It's really fun to put things to the test and see what they come out as, you know, especially considering that so many companies will, you know, keep that information close to the chest. An example of this is Heretic Knives. Now I like Heretic Knives. I've talked to their people. They've sent me a few knives. They've loaned me a few knives to review. And I asked them straight out. I said, hey, you know, are you willing to disclose the Rockwell hardness of your MagnaCut? Because people specifically care about what MagnaCut is testing at these days. You know, on a folding knife, if it's less than 62, people aren't generally happy. But if it's higher, if it's 62 or higher, people are generally happy.
Yeah.
And they told me straight out, no, we're not willing to disclose what our Rockwell hardness target is, because it is one of those topics where you'll never make everybody happy. I'll be honest. I wasn't quite satisfied with that answer, but the cool thing is that if you want to know, you could reach out to Brian. You can send him your knife. He'll do a Rockwell hardness test on it, which is awesome. So you never know, Brian. I might actually send some heretic knives your way because I want to, like, when they told me I couldn't know, now I have to know.
I want to answer a question real quick. So
Sure.
Blade Lab said, what does it cost to keep one of those indent testers certified or calibrated, basically? So I have a local place. I'm very lucky for this, by the way, because like you have to actually physically take the tester into the lab to get calibrated. And what they charge me is between $200 to $300, and what that depends on is the amount of work it takes to like calibrate it, and like if they have to do any repairs or anything like that, like minor repairs, like an arm is like not like a stiff or like they need to oil it or whatever. So basically, between $200 to $300 annually is what it costs. But that's only the calibration cost. You also need to pay for the blocks, the calibration blocks that you test to like check that your machine is still calibrated. Those can cost a couple $100. You don't have to replace them too often, but like as you use it, it'll get covered in indents, and then eventually you need a new one. So
what would you do if you are someone who lives in an area that, for example, like let's say you live in a rural area? How would you be able to get your tester certified?
So certified would be a no, because certified implies that you go to like an ISO like approved lab and like do what I do, right? You pay for it. You could get it. You could calibrate it yourself, and you would have just as accurate results if you know how to do it. Like you learn how to do it and you just do it yourself. You can I know how to calibrate my tester. The reason why I pay for it, even though I know how to do it myself, is because I'm protecting myself from legal liability. Because if someone wants to say, Brian, your test results are fake, this is slander, libel, whatever, right? I can just say, look, here's my papers, which is what I did when the Hinder stuff happened. I just showed my papers.
Yeah, and it's certified to an industry standard.
Not just that, but I'm not liable because I'm not the one who did the calibrating, right? Like it's just like, the lab is like they're the one putting their name behind this is certified, right? And so at that point, like you're protected in the sense of like, this isn't you just doing what you want. This is, you know what I mean? It's not dependent on your word.
Right.
It's you're paying for a professional service, if that makes sense. Like, so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You got to cover your ass, especially when you're making claims like that, because, you mentioned it earlier. You said, a lot of these knife makers, they don't necessarily like hearing negative things about their products put out there. I'm looking at some of the comments. I had a feeling this was going to pop up, and I purposefully did not force this topic, but I'll go ahead and pop it on here. There was a comment. Where was it? Hold on. John Tagamori says, Brian, how accurate is HRC tester that CBRX uses on his channel?
Yeah. So first of all, it's not really an HRC tester. That's the first important point to note, is that the lead tester tests lead values and then converts those values into Rockwell hardness values. The way that it works, if you're not familiar, is that it shoots a projectile, which bounces off of what you're testing, and then you measure the recoil. And basically, these testers are not designed for knife blades. What they're designed for is to be a portable tester to get a rough estimate of things on heavy objects that you can't, like, let's imagine like a steel boulder, right? You can't put that under a Rockwell tester. It's too big, right? But what you can do is go up to that boulder, put this portable tester up to it, and then just shoot a projectile at it and measure the recoil. The reason why you can't measure things that are thin and light, not heavy, like a knife blade, is because the material that you're testing is going to absorb a lot of that impact, and you're going to get a lower reading on average than you should. And so that's why a lot of these results are going to trend toward being on the low side, which is obviously problematic if you're criticizing a company. Like, you're always going to have low values, basically. Not always, but like most of the time.
When it's off, it's going to be off trending low, basically.
Usually, yes.
Yeah.
And so like you might have very precise results in the sense that, like, if you get, let's say the true value of your blade is 60, right? You might consistently get 58.1, 58.2, 58.1, and it might seem very consistent, right? Which is what precision means. but it might not be accurate because you're 2 points off.
Right.
And as for how off it is, it depends on the model that you're using and how much care you're using in your process and your protocol. So some models are obviously better than others, right? Although they're all not as accurate as a actual indenter. So some can be up to 6 points off, some can be 4 points off, some might be only 2 points off, right? So that's what it depends on the model. The second thing is it depends on how you do it. So like how steady is your hand? A portable tester that's handheld, right?
Right.
How steady is your hand? If you test at an angle, right, it's going to be off, right? You're supposed to be doing it straight up and down, right? Another thing is like, you can put something that's lighter. Now there's limitations and a knife blade does not fall under these limitations, but you can put a lighter object and then put a heavier block and couple it to that with like industrial grease and stuff like that. So if you're, but you want to like clamp it down to make sure that it's actually secure. You don't want to just like hold it down with your hand. So it really depends on like, are you following proper protocol? Are you testing the correct stuff? Like I think if you're testing something that's heavy, it's probably more accurate, right?
So the interesting thing about this topic, and I do my best to avoid drama, but sometimes I can't help it. One of the things that CBRX does that bothers me is that he will validate against his test block. Now, if you look at the Lieb website, the test block has the density that's necessary to get a more accurate result, right? Whatever he's putting on the test block is not that same density. So it's not just a matter of, whether or not it's accurate. It's a matter of consistency as well, because now we're talking about items and objects that are not dense enough. And so, for example, if you were to test a thicker blade, it might actually trend more towards accurate, or it might not. One knife, he could be off by 1 point. The next knife, he could be dead on, but because there's no consistency, we don't have anything to really base that off of. What I'm getting at is Brian did a video the other day on his Instagram, which I thought was amazing. You guys, if you're not following Brian on Instagram, I have no idea what you're doing. Follow him on Instagram. Great videos, and also very entertaining and educational. He was talking about, Brian, you were talking about something that I mentioned before the show, and that is the difference between accuracy and precision, because a lot of times people get them confused, but they're not in fact the same thing. So for those who might not have seen your video on that, what's the difference between accuracy and precision?
Yeah, so like I was saying a little earlier, like precision is your consistency basically. So, are you usually getting the same result? So, whether it's accurate or not, like if you're like, let's say it hits 58 the first time, and the second time and the third time, you're always hitting 58, 58, 58, instead of 57, 61, 63, 54, right? Like if you're getting always around the same number, then it's very precise. But accurate would be actually getting what it is, right? So
right.
If it's actually 60, then you need to hit 60, right? So accurate would be like, hitting 60, 61, 59, and then it averages to actually be 60, which is the true value. Now, if it's accurate and precise, it'll just be 60, 60, 60, 60 if it's actually 60. And that's ideal.
Right.
And this is something you get a lot with a Rockwell tester is it's very accurate and precise. Like when I'm testing a blade, I'll get 64.5, 64.6, 64.5, 64.6. And it's all like very tight in that range when it's calibrated properly. It's very precise and it's very accurate. When you see a Lieb tester, it can be very precise. Sometimes it's not accurate, and you can make adjustments to account for that to some extent. And one of the things that Blade Labs mentioned here is they're rated to be accurate for assuming the use is appropriate, right? So if it is heavy, if it is rigid, if it is large, if you're testing a thick, heavy object, it's going to be more accurate, right? But that's not what knife blades are.
Right. Right. And, for anybody who's questioning the ethics of this conversation, these are conversations that we need to have, and we need to have them because whenever there's information out there, people are looking for answers. there's a lot of desire for people to know more about the things that go into making knives, whether it's, blade grinding materials, whether it's the hardness of the blade, how can you tell, how much should you care? As it turns out, people care a lot about the accuracy of Rockwell hardness and the testing that goes on behind the scenes, because makers are always testing their stuff. Makers want to know, like, how good is this batch? How good is that? Should I aim for harder? Should I aim for softer? What are the effects? Does doing this make it more corrosion resistant, have more edge retention, or am I now going to go through too many consumables if it reaches this, because that can actually equal a monetary difference, especially if you're making it. That's something that you've actually mentioned before as a reason why a lot of companies don't want to do M390 harder than, like the 60 to 62, is because they would start blowing through a lot of their consumables, like their belts. But whenever it comes to the topic of, well, we're going to hold this company accountable because they said that they aim for 64, but I tested it at 62 or 60. The accuracy of these claims is important. And it's important because people that are looking for these answers are either someone who is about to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars or not. And when you give the wrong information and then you try to back it up by saying, well, like it's just for entertainment purposes, but you should trust my opinion because I have this process that I promise you is not only accurate, but also fair. That's kind of the rub for me is that you can't have it both ways. Either it's just for entertainment and your results should not be taken seriously, or you are trying to help people make informed decisions. And if that's the case, right, you need to be able to validate it against something that is an industry standard.
Yeah, and it's not just that. It's also, so like you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? You can't have it both ways. Be just entertainment and information, obviously.
Right.
One other thing I'll say is that the veneer of authenticity is much more dangerous than just truly being for entertainment. So when you portray yourself as, giving good information, but you're not, that's much more dangerous, which is why I think it's such a dangerous channel. To give you an example, like one thing he does is to test the force of a detent, right? Like how much force is needed. He'll push on it, right? With a little, force measuring device. And people are like, oh, wow, how scientific, right? That's much more scientific than someone just saying that the detent feels strong or weak, right?
Sure.
Or so it would seem. What he's not considering is that the angle of approach matters, right? To what his force reading will be, right? And he tries to replicate where his thumb would be, but like, you know what I mean? Like there's all sorts of factors that are going on here that are not being accounted for. And I think that's a little bit of a problem.
We lost Brian again. Hold on. We'll try to get Brian back. All right. There we go.
Yeah. So, but the point is that so there is room for operator. How should I say? I don't want to use the word manipulation, but really it is manipulation. There's room for operator, influence on the results, depending on how you want to test it. And that's why procedure is so important. Like we have protocol and standards of how you have to do things, right? Like what stops someone from, just being like, oh, I don't like this maker. I want the result to be lower. I'm going to use hand sanitizer instead of industrial grease. Right? Like what stops you from doing that? Yeah. Because there's a reason why we have a rule that you have to use industrial grease, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it's a standard.
Non-compressible fluid, etc. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so that's the problem is that I'm not saying he definitely manipulates his results. I'm saying there's nothing stopping him from doing that.
Sure. And
that's a problem if you're going to come off as objective and fair. And I don't think it's a coincidence that all the people that he has disagreements with, their knives are somehow bad in all these different ways. It's like, okay, I had an argument with Metal Complex. Now I'm going to objectively review the Excalibur. All right, you know what I mean? Like that,
yeah.
So just because you are not paid by a company to review a knife does not mean you are not biased. You can be biased against the person.
Yeah.
If you don't like someone, then you're biased against them, right? Like there's different ways for bias to form. You can have negative bias or positive bias. And I think he has a lot of negative bias.
Well, that's a really interesting topic because, you know, I try to look at things objectively. And the moment I start to see feel myself get emotionally involved, I'm like, okay, now is the perfect time to take an objective step backwards and see what's really going on here. I had a public conversation with CBRX on one of his videos. And at the end, because I challenged him with the bit of knowledge that I had, including a direct quote from Dr. Laren Thomas, who, while he's not the end all be all of resources, he is one of the most knowledgeable people in our space, right? I think that most people could agree on that. And he ended by saying, well, you know, if I would disagree. Yes, Laren Thomas is wrong. And I'm like, you know, you can't just dismiss a resource like that outright. But after that, he said, don't forget, this is just for entertainment. And I think that you have to really take him for his word at that. I don't think there's anything wrong with people enjoying his content, as long as you go into it with your eyes open, understanding that, you know, you're going to get a specific type of content. He's creating this kind of content because there's a demand for it. You know, I look at the comment section, not just of my videos, but of other channels. And a lot of people are like, oh, you know, of course you're going to say this. You got the knife for free. And what they really want is an opposing opinion to base things off of, because a lot of people, like we were mentioning earlier, a lot of people don't have a brick and mortar store they can go to experience these things. And I know that when I'm looking at something and I'm considering buying it, I try to look for one really positive review and one really negative review. And usually the truth for me is going to lie somewhere in between. And I know a lot of people do that subconsciously. So there's a demand for negative reviews out there because somehow there's a group of people who have asserted, if there's no negative reviews, everything must be biased or these guys must be paid. And, you know, I've seen those comments myself on my videos sometimes.
Yeah, and it's like sometimes the knife is actually good. Yeah. Like, you know, like, hey, guys, it's possible, right? Like a knife can't just, like, if you said, like, Brian, like, do you think this knife is good? I'd just be like, yeah, it's good. Like, what do you want?
Yeah, it's good.
Like, what do you want me to do? Like
10-second knife reviews, go.
I'm not going to force myself to say negative. Like, and anyone who knows me knows I don't hesitate to criticize stuff. Like, I really don't. Like, some people say I do it too much even, right? But, like, if something doesn't have a problem, I'm not going to make shit up. Like, what's the point?
So, you know, the irony here is that, like, you can never win in this situation, because if you are too positive, they'll say that you were paid for or that you're biased because you got it for free or whatever, right? But also, if you nitpick too much, it also annoys the crap out of people. An example of this was, like, there was a period of time where I convinced myself, okay, you have to find something to nitpick on every single knife. There's absolutely nothing that could be perfect out there. And you have to try to do this for the people who want to know, like, what could possibly be wrong with this knife, even if it's small. And so I did a review. This was like a year and a half ago. Maybe it was 2 years ago. I did a review on the CJRB Pyrite. I bought it outright. They didn't send it to me. CJRB didn't, you know, Artisan Cutlery did not know who I was. And the knife, is subjectively and objectively a good pocket knife, right? It's a good pocket knife. You know, it comes factory sharp, decent ergos, great action. You know, they're $40-$50. And the one that I got had steel handle scales. And I'm trying to come up with something to nitpick here. I'm like, well, you know, what could people possibly care about? Because that's what I want to talk about, is what people could possibly care about. And so I said, you know, I think it's baloney that they don't tell us what the steel handle scales are made out of, because the blade is steel and we care what the blade steel is made out of. Why wouldn't we also care what the other half of the knife is made out of? And if you go to that video, if you look up my very first CJRB Pyrite video, and I know I've done like 4 or 5, but if you look at the first one, people got pissed that I mentioned that. Like, I got made fun of, people like ranted at me. So you can't win. It doesn't matter what you do. You cannot win. You know, if you are too positive, people will take offense. If you're nitpick too much, people will take offense. So I mention this because I think it's entertaining that there's a whole group of people that have a demand for negative reviews. And that's where CBRX is seeing the growth. I just think that it's important that people look at that and take him at his word when he says it's just for entertainment. Watch his channel if you want. Be entertained. Absolutely. But understand it's not a scientific channel. It's just for entertainment.
Right. And another thing I want to mention with respect to that is that CBRX, he's giving recommendations. And when you give a recommendation, it's no longer for entertainment. When you say do not, because I've seen shorts where he literally says, I do not recommend you buy this knife, don't buy it.
Right.
We're going beyond entertainment here. We're trying to hurt companies, right? Like,
yeah.
if we're being honest. And technically speaking, you could argue that entertainment sometimes does hurt companies, right? Like if you're doing like a Saturday Night Live skit and you're making fun of like a company,
sure.
then you're going to hurt that company. Sure. Right. But there's nothing about an SNL skit that comes off as these are facts, whereas he is trying to say that he's presenting facts, and that's the fundamental difference, right? Like when SNL makes fun of the way someone talks, like
it's a joke.
These aren't facts. Yeah, it's a joke, right? Whereas the lead tester, he's not saying this is a joke. Haha, here's the punchline. Like, oh, 56 Rockwell, what a funny punchline. Like, no, it's not. This is not how he's actually framing himself, and so it really does feel like the entertainment shtick is a cop out in a sense.
100%, man. And I really enjoyed your take on that, you know, and that's why I'm telling people, like, you got to make sure that you're following Brian on Instagram. Lots of really great content. And Brian, believe it or not, this is one of my longest live streams that I've ever done. So when I tell you that I've really enjoyed having you on the live tonight, understand that that is 100% true. It's really nice to be able to connect with another like mind in the community that also likes to fall down the rabbit hole of information and not just seek more of it, but the best information possible. And I really also enjoy the fact that you're putting your Rockwell hardness tests up and readily available for people. I'll make sure to continue pointing people in that direction as that resource grows, because I think it's really valuable. But
for sure.
I am going to go ahead and call it a night. I've got to get up early for work tomorrow, but Brian, thank you so much for being willing to join the live. I'd love to have you back on here. You know, hopefully sometime in the near future. I'm sure we can coordinate that if you enjoyed being on. I'd definitely love to have you back on. I think it'd be cool. Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, I'm very much like easily accessible, honestly. In fact, someone else completely unrelated, asked me to do a live stream with them literally today. So I'm pretty easy to access in that sense. So yeah, anytime.
Yeah, man, that's amazing. But I would definitely love to collaborate with you more on these live streams. Who knows? Maybe we could get a forum discussion going. I think something like that could be cool. You know, possibly bring on a knife maker. Shout out to my man Donnie Bless, who's in the chat right now. You know, I think the community we're a part of is great, and there's a lot of great people just like you who are willing to have these discussions and maybe not shy away from the tougher ones. One of the things that I love is that everyone has different opinions, even industry professionals, and seeing those discussions happen is really exciting for me. So I'll definitely be reaching out to you to collaborate again in the future. Hopefully we can make that happen. It's been absolutely awesome having you on tonight. Before we head out, is there anything cool you're working on for the near future? Any new releases for your website? You know, what's new? What should the people know about before we call it a night?
So there's nothing new particularly from me. I'm actually just completely on the road of I need to bust my ass and work as hard as possible, make as many reblades as possible so I can buy the CNC. So the next 2 or 3 months, expect a lot more stuff being made than I've ever made in the past. So, you know, I know a lot of people say oh, it's never available and stuff, but it will, trust me, it'll be available in the next 3 months. I'm making a lot of stuff. So that's cool. In terms of regrinds, books are open now. So, you know, if you want to regrind, just reach out to me. And I'm also starting a Zerb wash service. So that's a Zerblast plus a tumble, which is just an extra finishing thing if people are interested.
Yeah.
So those are the 3 things really.
Dude, that's awesome, man. And I definitely might be reaching out to you about that Zerb wash. Real quick, is that something that is handle scale only, or could you do that on a blade for a blade finish as well?
For the Zerbosh?
Yeah.
Oh no, so the Zerbosh is 4 blades, and then Zerblast, which is just the Zerblast no tumble,
just for the handles.
Scales. Yeah.
Okay. All right, man. We might have to work something out because I think I might want to try that out on the blade of this Mojave.
For sure. And you know Kyle Coonley?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm working with him for that because I'm doing the Zerbosh and then he's doing the sharpening.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so we're sort of collaborating in that sense, which is cool.
Hey, real quick before we end it, shout out to Matt D for the $20 super at the end, man. He says, thanks for what both of you do for the community. Stay awesome. Hey, man, thank you so much. I know I enjoy it. I know Brian enjoys it. Guys, tonight has been one for the records. We went 2.5 hours. Generally speaking, I run out of steam going by myself. So, Brian, thank you again so much for joining the live stream. We definitely have to do this again soon. Guys, sure. If you're wondering when the next live stream will be, that will be on Saturday at 8 p.m. Mountain, which is 10 p.m. Eastern, which is 9 p.m. Central, which is 7 p.m. Pacific. From Brian and myself, we'll see you guys on the next